Winning wars has always stood at the heart of military history, yet it remains one of the hardest questions to answer in a broad and universal way. It is often easier to explain why a single conflict began than to explain why success unfolded across many different conflicts in many different societies. Victory is never just a matter of battlefield results. It is shaped by the values, expectations, and political cultures of the people involved. What one civilization calls triumph, another may see as survival, endurance, or even sacrifice. Defeat, loss, and success are never entirely neutral ideas. They are defined through memory, belief, and circumstance. That is why any serious discussion of war must avoid forcing one regional model onto the rest of the world. A narrow European understanding cannot explain the full range of military experience across global history, any more than it can explain world history as a whole. To understand how power worked in the early modern world, three major themes stand out. The first is the widening global reach of power and the growing influence of European states overseas. The second is the place of technology in military change, especially the belief that better weapons automatically produced better results. The third is the bond between warfare and the growth of stronger, more organized states. These themes overlap constantly. None of them can be separated from the others for long, because each shaped the conditions in which wars were fought and empires were built. The early modern age brought regions of the world into closer contact than before, and it also saw Europe extend its influence across seas and continents. These two developments were closely connected. European expansion linked lands that had previously been separated in political imagination as much as in geography. The Americas were turned into a connected part of a wider world through conquest, colonization, and trade directed by Spain and Portugal at first, then by England, France, and the Dutch Republic. At the same time, Portuguese voyages at the end of the 15th century pushed armed European shipping into the Indian Ocean, where commerce and naval power began to merge in new ways. This did not happen because Europe had always dominated global affairs. In much of the 15th century, European states were far from decisive on the world stage. They could not stop Ottoman expansion into southeastern Europe, and the fall of Constantinople to Mehmed the Conqueror revealed just how limited European power still was. In that moment, no Western kingdom matched Ottoman strength, and the Ottoman state stood as the most formidable political force in Europe. In Asian waters, the leading maritime power was not European at all. It was China, whose fleets in the first half of the century sailed into the Indian Ocean on a scale that no European kingdom could yet match. By the end of the 16th century, however, the balance looked very different. Ottoman armies had continued to advance, taking Belgrade, crushing Hungary, and extending their reach across the eastern Mediterranean, even if they also met limits in places such as Vienna, Corfu, and Malta. Yet the most dramatic changes appeared farther away from Europe itself. Spanish conquest in the Americas had already destroyed the Aztec and Inca empires, helped not only by steel and cavalry, but also by political divisions among indigenous powers, and by the catastrophic spread of disease. Spanish rule then expanded across the Pacific into the Philippines, linking American silver, Asian trade, and European monarchy in a single imperial system. Portuguese fleets shattered major naval rivals in the Indian Ocean and imposed themselves on key sea routes. A new pattern of power was emerging, one in which European states could exert influence far beyond their own shores. Even so, Europe did not suddenly dominate all of Asia. In East Asia, the main strategic struggle centered on the rivalry between major regional powers, especially the contest over Korea in the late 16th century. In Southeast Asia, Europeans appeared in coastal politics, but they did not determine the fate of every kingdom. In mainland, polities such as Siam, internal and regional dynamics still mattered far more than foreign intrusion. In India, the great turning point was not European conquest, but the fall of the Lodi rulers and the rise of the Mughal Empire, which built and defended its power across much of northern and central India. In Persia, the Safavids established their own authority through cavalry warfare and state formation, while their main military concerns remained the Ottomans and the Uzbeks, not the Portuguese presence in the Gulf. European pressure could be real, but it often existed alongside much larger regional struggles. Still, overseas European expansion did not fade. It continued through the 17th century as English and French settlements spread along the Atlantic coast of North America, and Dutch power took hold in parts of maritime Southeast Asia, especially in the spice-producing islands. At the same time, Russia expanded eastward across Siberia until it reached the Pacific, creating a direct frontier between a European empire and China. Maritime and territorial growth worked together, and by then, European states were no longer simply regional powers, acting close to home. During the first 3 quarters of the 18th century, this expansion continued, though unevenly. Portuguese influence pushed deeper into Brazil, Spanish power moved up the Pacific coast of North America, and Britain and France competed bitterly in the interior of the continent around the Great Lakes and beyond. Indigenous resistance could be fierce and at times tactically effective. Campaigns against the British, including the uprising associated with Pontiac, showed clearly that native forces could inflict serious damage. Yet long-term resistance was difficult to sustain, partly because of political fragmentation, local economic structures, and the massive demographic disruption caused by disease and colonial settlement. In some borderlands, such as the northern reaches of Spanish America, peoples like the Apaches checked European advance more effectively. In India, British influence rose sharply in Bengal and along the southeastern coast, but only in the middle of the 18th century, and even then the decisive challenges for northern India were not European at all. Persian invasions, Afghan campaigns, and Maratha expansion mattered more directly to the balance of power on the subcontinent. The most important lasting defeat suffered by European imperial power in this era came in North America, when Britain lost its 13 colonies after a long war of independence. Yet even here the picture is more complex than a simple reversal of European expansion. Britain was defeated by colonists of European origin using European military traditions, European weapons, and receiving critical aid from France, with Spain and the Dutch Republic also drawing British power into a wider international struggle. The conflict did not represent the collapse of European global influence, so much as a struggle within the European world itself. For that reason, it would be misleading to present the period as a simple story of unstoppable European victory. In large parts of Africa and the Pacific, European influence remained shallow for a long time. In 18th century East Asia, the most expansive and powerful state was China, not any European monarchy. Russian pressure against Persia met limits, and the Ottoman state, despite severe defeats in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, showed remarkable resilience and recovered important territory more than once. Europe's ascent was real, but it was neither total nor uncontested. What changed most clearly was control over connections. The routes that linked distant parts of the world increasingly passed through European hands, or were shaped by European navigation, finance, and armed shipping. This helped create a more integrated global economy. Goods moved across vast spaces in patterns that would have been impossible without these networks. Tea from India could be carried to North America. porcelain from China could pass through Dutch or other European commercial systems into European markets, and the profits of such trade strengthened maritime states. This commercial advantage fed economic growth, especially in places such as Britain, where overseas trade and naval strength reinforced one another. These same maritime systems also transformed populations. European control at sea made large-scale migration possible, not only for settlers leaving Europe, but also for enslaved Africans carried across the Atlantic under brutal conditions. The demographic shape of the Americas was permanently altered. Population growth in Europe, especially after earlier periods of stagnation, provided settlers who moved into places like Pennsylvania and also pushed agricultural frontiers into other zones, including the southern steppe lands of the Russian Empire. Sea power, commerce and population movement became part of the same historical process. At first glance, placing so much emphasis on European expansion may seem exaggerated. Large parts of the world remained beyond direct European influence. European maps of Central Asia and inland Africa were still incomplete or deeply inaccurate well into the modern era. In places such as Tibet, where Chinese power expanded, or Mombasa, where Omani Arabs drove out the Portuguese, or West African kingdoms that controlled coastal trade, or in regions of Angola and Mozambique, where inland advance stalled, European political control was clearly limited. Yet even where direct conquest failed, a crucial imbalance had appeared. Europeans operated along the coasts of Asia, while Asian fleets did not appear off the coasts of Europe in the same way. Europeans crossed and charted oceans, explored the Pacific, named places, redrew space through maps, and gradually imposed new ways of organizing the world. Their goods circulated widely, their confidence grew, and their ambitions reshaped commerce, religion, labor, and culture. The results were often violent and destructive, above all in the slave trade, but their historical significance is impossible to ignore. European expansion reconfigured the globe in ways that still define the modern world. Across much of the early modern world, people usually explained military success through qualities such as leadership, courage, discipline, and skill with weapons, rather than through technology alone. The idea that technological change was the main engine of military superiority became especially powerful in European thought. Over time, the belief grew that innovation in weapons could explain not only battlefield outcomes, but also broader historical change. Gunpowder came to be seen as one of the decisive forces that ended the medieval order and opened the road to the modern age. Later generations, living through even faster technical transformation, pushed this argument further and treated weapons as the clearest measure of military strength. This emphasis had obvious appeal. Weapons are tangible. They stand at the meeting point of training, tactics, organization, and economic capacity. They also invite easy comparison. A gun can be measured, a wall can be inspected, a sword can be weighed. Such comparisons seem to offer objective answers across different societies and eras, even when the deeper cultural setting is less familiar. That is why both scholars and general audiences have often been drawn to weapons as the key to military history. Modern debates encourage the same habit. Contemporary war is often discussed through aircraft performance, missile range, electronic systems, and destructive power. The atomic bomb remains the most dramatic example of technology appearing to transform war itself. Even though it was used in combat only twice, its existence reshaped planning, deployments, alliances, and the entire structure of modern military thought. The same pattern appears in debates over stealth, precision-guided munitions, satellites, and digital warfare. Yet weapons by themselves rarely explain enough. The history of the atomic bomb makes that clear. technology does not act in a vacuum. Its meaning depends on politics, strategy, culture, economics, and the choices of governments and societies. Judging weapons outside their context can easily mislead. The size of a gun or the length of a spear says little on its own about tactical use, strategic purpose, morale, or endurance. It says even less about the willingness to absorb losses or impose them. Military power depends not just on tools, but on institutions, doctrine, leadership, and the conditions under which violence is used. Even possession of the most destructive weapon does not guarantee political success in every setting. This matters especially because technology has so often been used to explain Europe's global rise. A familiar argument holds that a relatively small part of the world's population was able to dominate vast territories and peoples for centuries, because Europeans possessed superior weapons, especially firearms at sea and on land. Cannon-armed ocean-going ships gave European powers a major naval advantage from the late 15th century onward. Gunpowder at sea also changed the balance between manpower and capital. A relatively small crew on a heavily armed vessel could project force over great distances, allowing states to strike, patrol, and trade across oceans without maintaining huge populations at sea. On land, the advantage of steel weapons, horses, and firearms has often been presented as central to the Spanish conquest of the American empires and to Russia's eastward drive into Siberia. From that perspective, firepower appears as the decisive multiplier. Small European expeditions could defeat much larger opponents because their weapons created a gap in battlefield capability. This interpretation is attractive because it turns a specific pattern of success into a general explanation. Yet, it leaves too much out. In some regions, Europeans also enjoyed demographic strength at the crucial point of contact. In many cases, they secured powerful local allies. Their success depended not only on hardware, but also on diplomacy, disease environments, social fracture among enemies, and access to economic resources. European military advantage, where it existed, should not be exaggerated into an all-purpose answer. It developed gradually from deeper economic, institutional, and technical changes that took shape over centuries. Technology was part of the story, but not an independent force floating above society. A wider perspective also shows that some of the most revealing military encounters were the ones that never took place. Naval history offers especially good examples. In the early 15th century, China possessed the greatest capacity in the world for sending large fleets over long distances. About a century later, Portugal had taken that role in the Indian Ocean. Yet, when attention falls only on Portuguese victories, it becomes easy to ignore the absence of major maritime wars between Portugal and the great naval powers of East Asia. China, Japan, and Korea did not mount sustained distant challenges to Portuguese expansion, largely because they did not pursue the same kind of long-range naval strategy at that moment. Portugal, for its part, often chose trade over territorial conquest in places such as Macau and Nagasaki, adapting itself to regional powers instead of provoking direct confrontation where the risks were greater. In that sense, the shape of empire was determined not only by battles fought, but also by priorities never pursued. The same pattern appears elsewhere. Spanish expansion in the Philippines and Russian movement along the northern Pacific were not met by full-scale maritime resistance from the major naval states of East Asia. This did not mean those states lacked ships or fighting capacity. Japanese amphibious operations in Korea during the 1590s showed that East Asian naval warfare could be large, complex, and aggressive. In fact, those campaigns were in several respects more formidable than some European expeditions that receive far more attention in conventional military history. But because they did not fit the familiar European narrative, they have often remained in the background. This reveals a deeper problem in the way military history is often told. Conflicts not involving Europeans are too often marginalized, no matter how large or decisive they were in their own regions. Major battles in India or East Asia can receive less attention than smaller engagements involving European forces simply because they do not fit the standard storyline of Western expansion. A battle such as Plassey became famous not only because of its local significance, but because later, Empire made it appear larger in retrospect. Other clashes involving far more troops and far greater regional consequences have often remained comparatively obscure. A second distortion appears when Europeans lose. Defeats inflicted on Dutch, Russian, or other European forces in Asia have often been treated as marginal episodes, rather than as evidence that local states and commanders could defeat Western opponents under the right conditions. Too often, such failures are explained only through the mistakes of the Europeans, as if the strengths of their enemies do not deserve equal attention. That habit weakens the broader analysis of military power and turns history into a one-sided tale of inevitable Western success. A third problem lies in the tendency to ignore unrealized conflicts. The absence of war can reveal as much about strategy as open combat. 16th century China was not a peaceful state. It fought on multiple fronts, deployed large armies, and defended its coasts. It even defeated a Portuguese force near its own waters. Chinese ships were often strongly built, and the state retained substantial inshore naval power. But China no longer sent great fleets across distant seas in the way it had earlier. There was no attempt to challenge Portugal far from the Chinese coast, and that decision mattered. It reflected priorities, geography, and strategic choice rather than simple weakness. If analysis focuses only on encounters that ended in territorial change or dramatic battle, it misses these quieter but equally important measures of relative power. For that reason, wars not fought deserve a place beside wars that were fought. They help reveal what states feared, what they ignored, what they were able to attempt, and what they considered worth the cost. They also remind us that military history is not a zero-sum contest, in which every European move automatically came at the direct expense of a non-European rival. Expansion, resistance, adaptation, avoidance, alliance, and selective engagement all shaped the early modern world. The history of warfare in this period is therefore not just the story of weapons or conquest. It is the story of how different societies understood power, mobilized resources, chose their enemies, and sometimes chose not to fight at all. That is where the deeper explanation of military success begins. The picture was far more complicated than a simple story of Europe defeating the rest of the world. Much of the military action carried out by European powers across the oceans between the mid-16th century and the early 19th century was actually aimed at other Europeans. The great overseas struggles of the age were often contests between rival imperial states fighting for ports, trade routes, islands, and colonies. The long conflict between Portugal and the Dutch stretched across Brazil, West Africa, India, Sri Lanka, and the Indonesian archipelago, and it showed clearly that European expansion was never just a matter of Europeans confronting non-Europeans. At the same time, most wars outside Europe were also fought between non-European powers. In many regions, the main military pressure came from neighbouring kingdoms, empires, tribal confederations, or rising dynasties, not from distant Western states. Expansion itself was not an exclusively European phenomenon. Long before the late 19th century, powerful states in Asia and Africa were also conquering territory, extending borders and absorbing weaker neighbours. Even later, when European imperial dominance had become much stronger, states outside Europe could still expand successfully under the right conditions. China offers one of the clearest examples. Between the late 17th century and the end of the 18th, the Qing state enlarged its control dramatically. It strengthened its hold over Mongolia, moved into Xinjiang, took Taiwan, pushed Russian influence away from the Amur region, and launched major expeditions toward Burma and Nepal. To leave out these gains is to distort the military balance of the period. It is easy to look backward from the 19th century, when China suffered severe military defeats at the hands of industrial European powers, and then assume weakness much earlier. But that approach imposes a later outcome on an earlier age. The same danger appears in the history of the Ottoman Empire. It is tempting to search for the origins of later decline in every earlier campaign. Yet that can flatten the reality of a given era and prevent a proper understanding of how power actually worked at the time. States must be judged in the context of their own moment, not simply as early versions of what they later became. This leads to a deeper problem in military history itself. The historian must constantly choose what deserves attention, and that choice is never neutral. Which battles matter most? Are they the ones that displayed the newest weapons, the ones that involved the largest armies, the ones that produced the highest casualties, or the ones whose long-term consequences proved greatest? Even that last measure is unstable, because consequences depend on perspective and timescale. A battle may seem decisive centuries later because it fits the story that later generations want to tell, while another clash that appeared just as important to those living through it may fade into the background. This problem becomes even sharper when comparing war on land with war at sea, or regional struggles with global ones. A battle like Plassey can be treated as more important in hindsight because it opened the way for British rule in India, yet many Indian rulers of the time would have seen invasions from the northwest as a more immediate and pressing danger than a relatively limited East India Company victory in Bengal. The same distortion appears within European history. Certain battles become famous because they seem to confirm a broader narrative that historians already accept. A French victory may be celebrated because it appears to symbolize the rise of France, while later Spanish successes are downplayed because they do not fit the familiar theme of Spanish decline. In that way, one engagement can be turned into a false turning point, not because contemporaries recognized it as such, but because later historians found it useful. Military history therefore faces the same challenge that affects all historical writing. Perspective changes everything. An event judged from 10 years away may seem decisive. Judged from a century away, it may seem minor. Judged from even farther away, it may disappear entirely behind larger trends. Yet the search for those larger trends can become too neat, too certain, and too dependent on hindsight. Even with these difficulties, it remains possible to question some of the grand claims made for military technology. The conquest of the Aztec Empire is a clear example. European steel weapons and armor gave Spanish fighters an important tactical advantage, but those tools alone do not explain the collapse of such a large power. Local alliances were essential. Many peoples in central Mexico were willing to fight beside the Spaniards, because they already resented Aztec domination. The political structure of the Aztec world made cooperation against the center possible. In India, too, the usual focus on firearms can be misleading. For long periods before the 18th century, handheld guns and infantry formations were not the decisive factor in every conflict. Cavalry, local military traditions, regional political structures, and the specific geography of warfare continued to shape outcomes in ways that weapon-based explanations often overlook. Naval history also deserves a more careful reading. Portuguese strength on the open ocean in the early 16th century was real. But that did not mean the Portuguese could dominate every kind of waterway. Deep draft sailing ships were effective on long sea routes, yet they were much less useful in shallow coastal zones, estuaries, and river systems. In those environments, local powers often had room to resist. Only much later, with the spread of shallow draft steam vessels, did European states gain a more reliable ability to project naval force into inland waters. Even in the 16th and 17th centuries, some Southeast Asian states built fleets capable of seriously challenging Portuguese activity. In places like Malaya and Sumatra, resistance at sea could be persistent and effective. A narrow European narrative tends to describe the Portuguese Empire in the Indian Ocean as if it was mainly broken by Dutch aggression. And Dutch victories were certainly important. But Portuguese positions were also squeezed by non-European powers in the Persian Gulf, on the East African coast, around the Bay of Bengal, and in island Southeast Asia. Persian, Omani, Indian and Indonesian forces all contributed to that pressure. The wider Portuguese experience overseas captures many of the problems that European powers faced abroad. They encountered a wide range of enemies in very different military settings. In some theatres, such as India, the Red Sea region, and the Horn of Africa, they confronted organised states that also used gunpowder weapons. One of those states, Morocco, destroyed the Portuguese king Sebastian and much of his army in a disastrous campaign. In other regions, such as Brazil, the Portuguese fought peoples with much looser political structures and without the same access to firearms. Elsewhere, as in parts of Central Africa, they confronted more organised states that at first lacked gunpowder but were still far from weak. Military strength did not depend on firearms alone, and once guns appeared, they often spread faster than Europeans expected. The Portuguese also had to defend themselves against other European enemies, and their own kingdom fell under Spanish control in the late 16th century. Overseas empire did not remove the danger at home. Because of this, Portugal had to build a military system, flexible enough to operate in completely different environments. That challenge would later define the experience of other European powers, with global ambitions, and it was not limited to them. Major non-European empires also fought across very different frontiers and against very different enemies. Ming and Qing China, Mughal India, and the Ottoman Empire all waged wars in varied terrains and against opponents using different styles of warfare. In the 16th century, the Ottomans fought Europeans on land in southeastern Europe and North Africa, confronted naval enemies across the Mediterranean and beyond, campaigned in the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, fought powerful rival states such as Persia and Egypt, and also faced less centralized enemies from the Caucasus to Arab tribal regions. Managing such a range of military demands required not only bravery and weapons, but also careful organization, especially in logistics. That raises another major issue: organization. Structural and cultural forms of organization provide a useful way of comparing military societies. Military effectiveness was not simply a matter of paying armies, feeding them, or moving them from one place to another. It also depended on how units were built, trained, commanded, and integrated into a larger system. In this field, European states gradually moved further than many others toward the large-scale standardization of military units. Soldiers were grouped into formations of predictable size, armed in similar ways, drilled through repeated routines, dressed in uniform clothing, and led through more regularized chains of command. This level of standardization made it easier to coordinate movement and maximize firepower. It also allowed allied or subsidized forces to be brought into action using much the same methods as national armies. That created a degree of interoperability that was not always present in the great Asian empires, where core troops and auxiliary troops could differ sharply in quality, equipment, and battlefield role. This contrast became especially visible in coalition warfare. In major European conflicts, allied forces from different states could often fight side by side, with relatively little difficulty because they shared similar methods. The same principle was later extended overseas. In India, for example, local troops were trained to fight according to European drills, making it possible to draw deeply on regional manpower while maintaining a familiar battlefield system. Discipline, especially as linked to controlled musket fire and strict obedience, became central to this approach. From the viewpoint of European officers, steadiness under command was the foundation of military superiority. Men were expected to hold formation, fire only on command, and subordinate individual impulse to collective timing. In that model, victory depended less on personal initiative than on reliability within a drilled system. Even so, organizational superiority had limits. European methods were not impossible to imitate, and over time elements of them spread outward. New style formations appeared in parts of the Ottoman world, in India and in 19th century Egypt. By the later 19th century, armies outside Europe could be equipped, trained, and deployed in ways that differed greatly from the military systems that European invaders had faced generations earlier. Yet this process was never simple. Adopting European weapons was one thing. Building the social discipline, administrative culture, and command habits needed to use them in the same way was something else. Drill depended on more than technique. It rested on a broader culture of restraint, repetition, and mechanical order that had become unusually developed in parts of Europe. Some states managed the transition impressively, with Japan becoming the clearest later example. But others struggled to make imported military forms function smoothly in their own political and social settings. And even when European organization was stronger, that did not guarantee victory in every encounter. European troops could still suffer disastrous defeats when they faced hostile terrain, resilient local forces, or strategic misjudgment. Still, organizational strength did matter, especially in projecting power across the oceans. The ability to transport men, weapons, supplies, and money over vast distances and keep them functioning once they arrived was one of the real foundations of European success. Technology helped, but it was not enough on its own. What mattered was the capacity to direct resources and sustain effort. Administrative systems, shipping networks, financial tools, and state planning all played a part. Over time, European states increasingly separated their commitments into two broad zones. One was the continental world, where rivalry centered on borders, dynastic claims, and territorial balance within Europe itself. The other was the Atlantic and global maritime world, where struggle focused on colonies, commerce, sea lanes, and distant strongholds. By the 18th century, major continental powers could move larger armies across greater distances than before, while maritime powers maintained expanding navies, larger fleets, and more substantial expeditionary forces overseas. In the 16th century, however, European manpower overseas was often astonishingly small. Several factors explain this. Large-scale European migration had not yet created strong settler populations that could support military action locally, although by the later 17th century, there were areas in the Americas where that was beginning to change. In many cases, European troops only became effective when backed by large numbers of local allies. This was true in Mexico, in parts of Africa, and later in India. Without such alliances and in the face of overwhelming demographic imbalance, Europeans could do relatively little in terms of conquering extensive inland territories. In many parts of Asia and West Africa, territorial conquest was not even the main goal. Trade was the prize. Control over ports, shipping routes, customs, and fortified bases often mattered more than direct rule over large populations. That commercial priority shaped strategy. In the Indian Ocean and nearby regions, European states often relied on warships, coastal bases, and selective intervention rather than massive conquest. One particularly revealing case was the Portuguese attempt to challenge Ottoman influence in the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, while also supporting the Christian kingdom of Abyssinia. This was a geopolitical and religious project, but not one based on seizing vast inland territories. The Portuguese tried instead to combine naval force, strategic strongholds, and small military expeditions. Results were mixed. A key failure came when Ardin entered the Ottoman sphere rather than the Portuguese one. That denied Portugal a critical position near the mouth of the Red Sea and limited its ability to interfere with Ottoman movement toward the Gulf, India, or East Africa. Even if Portugal had committed more troops and ships, the balance probably would not have changed much. Once the Ottomans had absorbed Egypt, they possessed demographic and strategic depth that the Portuguese could never match. Portuguese victories at sea showed that tactical or technical superiority could matter. But those victories did not erase the larger numerical and political advantage of the Ottoman system. In many cases, Portuguese survival in the region depended less on overwhelming strength than on the fact that the Ottomans had other priorities. The rivalry between the Ottomans and the Safavids opened room for Portuguese influence, and Portugal benefited from that larger regional competition. In Persia, the Portuguese could coexist with local powers because those powers had their own calculations and enemies. This is why broad formulas such as the West against the rest do not explain enough. What mattered was the interaction between specific European initiatives and the complicated rivalries of local states. This pattern changed more clearly in the late 19th century, when imperial expansion entered a new phase. At that point, direct territorial conquest across Africa and Asia became much more important than it had been in earlier centuries. Even where states were not fully annexed, they were often reduced to buffer zones, drawn into financial dependence, or forced to accept borders defined by European imperial power. Afghanistan, Persia, and Siam survived formally outside direct rule, but they did so within a world increasingly structured by imperial pressure. China retained sovereignty, yet foreign economic control and external intervention cut deeply into its autonomy. The conquest of established African and Asian polities on a broad scale was largely a later development, and it demanded a different kind of military system from the one that had once sufficed for seaborne trade empires. Campaigns at the end of the 18th century already hinted at what this newer age would require. A central challenge was no longer simply reaching distant theatres, but moving substantial forces into position, supplying them steadily, and shifting them according to strategic need. Logistics underwent a transformation as organisation, industry, and technology began to reinforce one another. At the same time, Europe experienced continuing demographic growth, which made it easier to raise larger armies and fleets without crippling the civilian workforce. More young men were available for service, even as industry and commerce expanded. The result was not only stronger military establishments, but stronger states capable of sustaining prolonged conflict. Yet most of that greater military power was still not used primarily against non-European societies. it was first developed in rivalry among European states themselves. The same was true across the Atlantic. In the 19th century, the United States devoted its greatest military effort not to overseas conquest, but to internal war. Its civil conflict dwarfed its earlier campaigns against Mexico, and large-scale projection of American power beyond the mainland came only later. Competition within the European and European-American world drove innovation, standardization, and continual adaptation. Those developments later made overseas conquest easier, but they were not originally created for that purpose alone. This internal competition had enormous consequences. It produced continuous pressure for military improvement, and that, in turn, supplied the means for projecting force against non-European societies. Later, global wars in the 20th century would badly damage the will and legitimacy behind imperial expansion, even if the technological capacity remained. But in the 19th century, the multipolar rivalry of Europe strengthened European states in relation to much of the rest of the world. Weapons perfected in European conflicts, including rifled arms and later industrial-era systems, were then carried overseas. Even so, it would be wrong to imagine that firepower alone explains imperial conquest. The wider transformation of transport, administration, and industry mattered just as much. Railways, steam power, and the coordination of state resources made armies more mobile and supply systems more reliable, far beyond Europe itself. Alongside technology and organization stood culture. Military expansion was also driven by ideas, values, and justifications that made large efforts seem necessary or legitimate. These motives changed over time. The religious and frontier mentality that shaped Iberian expansion in the 16th century was not the same as the racial ideologies and claims of civilizational superiority that appeared more openly in the 19th. European views of other societies also shifted. China, for example, was not widely portrayed in early centuries in the same dismissive way that later imperial rhetoric would frame it. Earlier fantasies of conquest existed, but they lacked both plausibility and broad acceptance. Only later did a more systematic language of decadence and domination become common. These cultural assumptions mattered because they encouraged aggression, offensive war, and the seizure of territory. Such attitudes were not automatic. They emerged under particular conditions and varied from one place to another. European expansion in the Americas was deeply shaped by a strong drive for land and settlement, whereas in the Indian Ocean commercial control remained the dominant aim for much longer. Even trade itself meant different things in different regions. The military and political realities surrounding commerce in Siberia were not the same as those near Hudson Bay, and both differed again from the conditions of the Indian Ocean world. Treating trade as a single universal motive hides the varied forms it took in practice. The same need for precision applies when comparing military systems. European infantry was not equally effective everywhere. Its success depended heavily on terrain, logistics, and the nature of the enemy. In 18th century India, British infantry performed better in some coastal and riverine zones, near its bases, than in regions that favoured the fast-moving, light cavalry of powers such as Mysore or the Marathas. Under the wrong conditions, disciplined infantry could be outmanoeuvred or cut off. Context remained decisive. Even after noting all these limits and complications, the broader question still remains. How did Western powers achieve such military weight over time? Technology clearly played a major role, but only if technology is understood in the broadest sense. It includes not just guns and ships, but also the economic and material systems that made flexible use of resources possible. In the early stages, these advantages were more decisive at sea than on land. Maritime technology was crucial because it allowed Europeans to move power across the world and sustain it there. On land, one of the most important elements was often not the musket alone, but the fortress. Strong defensive works, artillery-backed positions, and the ability to hold key points could offset smaller populations and weaker resource bases. That interpretation is too neat to capture what was really happening. It places too much weight on a single line of development and, in doing so, flattens a much wider military landscape. The Ottoman Empire, for example, cannot be understood only through its clashes with Christian Europe. For long stretches of time, its conflicts with Persia demanded equal attention and sometimes far more of its resources. The same problem appears elsewhere. Strong fortifications and infantry firepower did not preserve Ming China from conquest by the Manchus. That alone should warn against any model that treats one set of weapons or defensive systems as a universal answer. Still, there is something useful in focusing on the defensive side of European warfare. Popular memory is often drawn to oceanic expansion, overseas conquest, and dramatic victories in the Americas. But European states also spent enormous effort holding vulnerable frontiers. Fortified places mattered deeply, whether famous strongholds such as Vienna, Corfu, and Malta, or less celebrated defensive lines built to block raids from steppe enemies. These positions could shape campaigns, absorb pressure, and buy time in ways that were strategically decisive. Yet even this view becomes too narrow if it assumes that states naturally keep expanding until forcefully checked. That is a doubtful assumption. In the 16th century especially, the limits on land expansion were often severe, and military ambition was only one factor among many. Even so, keeping the Ottomans in view is essential, because it breaks the illusion that gunpowder belonged mainly to Europe. Several major Islamic empires built powerful states around the effective use of firearms and artillery. The Ottomans, Safavids, Mughals, and Sayyadian rulers of Morocco all belonged to a wider world in which gunpowder had become central to politics and war. Older descriptions sometimes imagined the Ottomans as relying mostly on giant bombards, but their artillery was in fact far more varied and practical. Smaller and medium-sized cannon formed a large part of their strength, giving them flexibility as well as shock value. They also proved capable of producing the powder needed to sustain war on a major scale. Fortification tells a similar story. Sophisticated defensive construction was not a European monopoly. Ottoman armies built and improved strongholds wherever they advanced, including major positions in contested frontier zones. The same was true farther east. Fortresses in India could be formidable enough to delay European siege guns and force prolonged assaults. At the same time, quality varied greatly. A fortress might be strong while the artillery mounted on it was unreliable, badly cast, or difficult to aim with consistency. In Persia, the Safavids never matched the Ottomans in the effective battlefield use of cannon and muskets. All of this shows why military technology has to be placed back into context. The crucial question is not simply who possessed guns, but how they were made, organized, supplied, maintained, and integrated into a larger military culture. In India, that culture varied sharply from region to region, and different military worlds produced different ways of using the same tools. The connection between warfare and state building becomes especially important here. Military force depended not only on courage or weapons, but on the ability of states to gather taxes, control violence, and make both of those powers seem legitimate. These things were closely linked. Armies and fleets were expensive whether or not they were equipped with the newest weapons. Permanent forces create constant pressure on the treasury, because they had to be fed, clothed, armed, paid, and moved even in times without active war. A state that relied on troops assembled only for campaigns faced fewer continuous expenses, and therefore did not need the same financial machinery. The difference was not absolute, since many systems lay somewhere in between, but it had real social and military consequences. Where different systems collided, those consequences could become starkly visible. A recurring pattern across the period can be seen in the long struggle between more settled agrarian societies and nomadic or semi-nomadic peoples. This rivalry appeared in many forms, from Chinese wars against the Mongols to later frontier conflicts elsewhere. Farming societies usually supported larger populations and, through taxation, could sustain more developed state institutions. That gave them the potential to raise substantial armies and sometimes to keep those armies in being for long periods. Revolutionary America offers a revealing example. The rebel colonies created a standing army and funded it through taxation, and the demands of supporting that force pushed politics toward greater centralization. By contrast, pastoral societies generally had smaller populations and less developed state structures. They rarely built the same kind of permanent logistical system or specialized siege capacity, and in war they often depended more heavily on speed, raiding, and local mobility. Terrain and climate reinforced these differences. Methods of war reflected them as well. Mobile peoples usually relied more on cavalry, while settled states placed greater emphasis on numbers, infantry, fortifications, and supply. Cavalry, in particular, deserves more respect than it often receives in simplified accounts of military change. The early modern age is frequently told as the triumph of gunpowder, and there is truth in that. Spanish and Portuguese expansion and the great Ottoman victories against Persia, Egypt, and Hungary all reflected the growing importance of firearms and artillery. Yet cavalry remained central in many parts of the world, not as a relic of an older era, but as a highly effective military arm. Mobility mattered for strategy, for supply, and for the shape of battle itself. Horsemen could move faster than infantry, strike where least expected, and create a different relationship between distance, numbers, and timing. Cavalry also did not stand outside the world of firepower. Mounted archers had already shown centuries earlier how mobile warfare and missile combat could be combined with devastating effect. That tradition did not vanish. Horse archers still played a major role in 16th century warfare, including in major South Asian battles. In many campaigns, mounted archers fought alongside foot musketeers and artillery, and together they formed highly effective mixed systems. Ottoman, Mughal, and Safavid victories all showed how these combinations could work. Chinese armies advancing against Mongol and Manchu enemies likewise discovered how dangerous mobile mounted archers still were. For that reason, it is misleading to focus only on infantry armed with gunpowder, and overlook the continuing value of cavalry, whether carrying bows or firearms. Mounted troops could adapt to gunpowder weapons when useful, but they did not depend on that transition in order to remain powerful through the 16th and 17th centuries. In North Africa, mounted soldiers trained to fire from horseback played a real role in defeating a European invasion. In later South Asia, mounted musketeers and heavy cavalry were still decisive in major battles. Cavalry also remained important across broad regions of Africa, especially in the belt south of the Sahara. Treating cavalry as outdated says more about modern assumptions than about early modern warfare itself. In Europe, cavalry became proportionally less dominant over time, although it could still be decisive in battle. Elsewhere, the strategic situation was different. North Indian rulers had to be ready to face invasions led by cavalry-heavy powers from Afghanistan or Persia. Safavid Persia, in turn, faced opponents whose mounted warfare placed less pressure on innovation in firearms and tactics. Long peace on one frontier could reduce the incentive for change on another. Once cavalry is no longer treated as automatically obsolete, broader assumptions about states and military success also need to be questioned. Some social and political systems were indeed poorly suited to supporting large standing armies, and in the 18th and especially 19th centuries, several such systems were overwhelmed by states with greater capacity to mobilize and direct manpower and resources. The Russian advance against steppe peoples is an obvious example. But reading that later outcome back into the early modern world creates distortions. It imports 19th century assumptions about infantry drill, artillery power, and centralized administration into a period that worked by different rules. It also reinforces a familiar belief that the strongest states are simply the ones that can organize and command their populations most effectively. In Europe, this idea appears clearly in explanations of why Poland was partitioned by its neighbours. Stronger states seem more capable because they can coordinate money, manpower, and force more efficiently. Yet even this approach has weaknesses. Governmental strength is never fixed or uncontested. It is always under negotiation, always vulnerable to crisis, and always shaped by particular circumstances. There is also the practical issue of scale. The level of organisation needed to maintain a large, permanent navy operating across oceans, or huge standing armies marching across continents, was not necessary for every kind of war. Many military systems around the world were entirely adequate for the conflicts they were designed to fight. Administrative sophistication by itself did not guarantee success either. China offers a clear warning on that point, since its state machinery did not prevent major defeats at the hands of steppe or frontier enemies. Military systems must be judged by whether they were fit for purpose in their own environment. That phrase matters because war did not serve only to conquer. It also preserved existing arrangements. Armies crushed rebellions, protected ruling elites, guarded borders, and enforced social hierarchies. In Europe, states gradually came to dominate large-scale, organised violence, but they did so in cooperation with social elites who continued to monopolise command. Those elites were generally willing to adapt to new forms of military organisation, including armies directed more directly by the state and a gradual reduction in the dominance of cavalry. In other regions, elite groups were often less willing to accept similar changes. That difference mattered. Even so, the contrast should not be overstated. Large empires such as the Ottoman and Mughal states struggled to monopolize violence completely, and internal warfare could weaken them as much as foreign enemies did. Yet Europe itself was hardly peaceful. Across the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, it was repeatedly torn by war on a scale at least equal to, and often greater than, the violence inside those empires. What made Europe different was not the absence of conflict, but the political form in which conflict unfolded. Warfare took place within a multipolar system of reasonably stable states, rather than mainly through the collapse of a single imperial structure. In that setting, armies were usually instruments of the state rather than forces aimed at destroying the state itself. Political and social revolutions changed that pattern at moments, especially when they reshaped the composition and outlook of the officer corps. But armies were generally not revolutionary by nature. More often, the strain of paying for them and keeping them effective forced governments to change. That pattern was not unique to Europe. Elsewhere too, military needs pressed states toward new institutions and new forms of control. There were important examples across the wider world of rulers, reshaping their governments in response to military demands. Yet, European powers faced a challenge that no non-European state confronted in quite the same way. They had to organise and sustain both land and sea warfare across oceans. This became especially important in the middle of the 18th century, when Britain and France began raising large local armies in India while also sending significant numbers of regular troops to North America. That produced a breadth of military capacity unlike anything possessed by other states of the time. It created experience in moving forces, coordinating distant operations, combining naval and land power, and using local manpower within an imperial framework. Later, in the 19th century, that range of capability would become one of the main channels through which industrial technology, population growth, and economic strength were turned into worldwide political and military advantage. In that sense, Europe's distinctive global role rested on a distinctive interaction between state formation, economic incentives, and technological development. Other major societies were perfectly capable in many individual respects. China, Korea, and Japan all possessed centralized states to varying degrees. They knew how to build large ships, they could cast guns. Their economies and cultural achievements did not obviously lag behind those of early modern Europe, nor did they necessarily need much from Europe. But what developed less strongly in East Asia was the same kind of self-reinforcing cycle between profit, war, trade, colonization, and technical change that drove Europe outward. In Europe, the possibility of commercial gain repeatedly encouraged maritime expansion, and that expansion stimulated improvements in shipbuilding, navigation, administration, and military organization. War and trade pushed one another forward. Colonization added new incentives, and states learned to support these ventures because the rewards could be enormous. Out of that interaction came the global trading and imperial networks that would define the 19th century world. The sea has never belonged naturally to humanity in the way land does. It cannot be owned in any simple sense, and it does not behave like a fixed political space. It divides territories, yet it also binds them together. Because of that, war at sea has always been more than a branch of military history. It has been a distinct kind of human struggle shaped by an environment that resists easy control. Naval conflict developed under the pressure of politics, trade, geography, weather, and technology, all of which determined how far people could travel, how long they could survive afloat, and how effectively they could fight. From the late medieval world to the threshold of industrial society, the changing conditions of life at sea transformed the character of maritime warfare. At its core, war at sea was a contest over movement. The crucial question was who could use the great sea routes and who could deny them to others. Those maritime routes carried trade, troops, information, and wealth. They allowed states and commercial groups to move goods over long distances, send armed force across water, and profit from the protection or seizure of shipping. As a result, conflict at sea was never fought for abstract reasons alone. It was fought in the interest of merchants, rulers, investors, port cities, colonial interests, and governments that depended on control of maritime exchange. It was also fought by those who feared what rivals might do if given unchallenged access to the sea. During the early modern era, this struggle became far more important because oceanic trade expanded rapidly. European powers pushed outward across the globe, and a wider international economy emerged in which the steady movement of goods became essential to both wealth and power. Sea routes became the arteries of a changing world. For those who attacked, they offered access and opportunity. For those who defended, they became zones that had to be watched, patrolled, and protected from invasion or disruption. From a modern point of view, it is tempting to separate maritime life into neat categories. Trade appears to belong to merchants, taxation and protection to governments, and robbery at sea to pirates. But that distinction became clear only after centuries of institutional change. In medieval and Renaissance Europe, those boundaries were far less stable. Much warfare at sea was carried out not by centralized states, with formal navies, but by merchant communities centered on powerful trading cities. These groups could behave as peaceful traders when profit encouraged restraint, and as violent competitors when force seemed useful. They organized embargoes, attacked rival shipping, backed friendly factions abroad, and sometimes even launched military expeditions. Protection was not usually provided by a national navy in the modern sense. Merchants often protected themselves. Coastal defense depended more on local militias and fortified positions than on permanent fleets. Rulers with territories connected by water naturally wanted to use the sea to transport men and arms, but even then they frequently relied on ships furnished by trading communities. Under such conditions, the difference between peace and war was often blurred. What one side condemned as piracy might, in practice, be a tolerated or semi-official form of warfare. Violence at sea remained diffuse, private, and local for a very long time. Before the late 15th century, very few states possessed anything that could truly be called a permanent navy. Over time, that world changed. The institutions surrounding maritime war gradually moved towards specialization, central control, and a stronger concentration of force in the hands of territorial states. This transformation formed part of the wider process of state building in early modern Europe. Governments built navies that were increasingly bureaucratic, tax-funded, and subordinated to long-term policy. Independent trading communities mostly surrendered their former right to wage violence at sea, or else adapted by taking a quieter role as neutral carriers without major naval ambitions of their own. As states became better at controlling force and presenting themselves as legitimate protectors, the older scattered use of maritime violence began to decline. Piracy diminished in much of Europe and in large parts of the overseas empires built by Europeans. Merchant vessels increasingly sailed with fewer weapons and smaller crews, carrying only what was needed to handle the ship, rather than to defend it in serious combat. By the 18th century, this change was striking. The reduced burden of private protection lowered the cost of trade and made long-distance commerce safer and more profitable. In that sense, states did more than wage war. They created a framework in which private actors could invest with less fear, and maritime commerce could expand under more predictable conditions. At the same time, the rise of state power pulled navies into conflicts that had goals far beyond the sea itself. Naval warfare was no longer only about protecting traders or raiding rivals. Fleets became instruments in broader political struggles over territory, prestige, dynastic competition, and continental dominance. Rulers fought on land and at sea, not merely for maritime routes, but for influence within Europe, for strategic regions, and for standing in the eyes of their own subjects and foreign courts. Even when war was not caused directly by trade, trade still suffered or benefited from what happened at sea. The exact effect of war and blockade on commerce in the 16th and 17th centuries remains open to debate. But by the 18th century, it became unmistakably clear that major maritime wars could disrupt enemy trade on a vast scale, damage imperial networks, and lead to the capture of colonies. Sea power could determine whether an empire thrived or weakened. The development of permanent navies, stronger states, and new military technologies all unfolded in roughly the same broad period, much as similar changes transformed warfare on land. It is natural to connect them, but the relationship was not simple. Centralized governments clearly helped sustain permanent fleets and systematic technological improvement. Yet weaponry and ship design also developed through private enterprise, commercial ambition, and the demands of long-distance trade. In some respects, technology moved faster than the full institutional rise of centralized states. Gun-armed ships appeared and spread before many governments possessed the administrative machinery to maintain large standing forces effectively. That suggests naval and military technology cannot be understood only as the product of mature state power. It also grew through the efforts of merchants, private adventurers, colonial entrepreneurs, and rulers looking for advantage. What makes the European experience distinctive is that well-armed ships, expanding commerce, colonization, and state building increasingly reinforced one another. Violence, profit, and administration began to feed the same system. Because maritime war joined commerce and power so closely, historians have often argued over the true motives behind particular conflicts. Were these wars fought for the glory and security of rulers, or for the profit of merchants and colonial interests? In reality, those goals often overlapped. Conflicts involving the Dutch, the Spanish, the English, the French, and the Scandinavians have all been interpreted through both lenses. One historian might describe a maritime war as a struggle for trade routes and customs revenues, while another might frame it as a contest for strategic security and political domination. Yet this contrast can be exaggerated. In many cases, mercantile and political objectives worked together rather than against each other. That cooperation mattered because it helped different interest groups unite behind the expense of permanent navies. Merchants wanted protection and access. Rulers wanted power and leverage. Ports, financiers, and state officials all found reasons to support fleets that had to be maintained even in peacetime. That degree of organized backing represented a major change from earlier European history. In naval warfare itself, Europe remained the main center of advanced maritime conflict throughout this period. Indigenous states in the Americas and much of Africa did not develop naval systems on the same scale or in the same form. In the Indian Ocean, long before European arrival, an extensive commercial world already existed, and early firearms were known there as well. Local shipbuilders adopted elements of European technology quickly, and some rulers created modest forces modelled partly on European practice. Yet no local power succeeded in overturning European command at sea on a comparable level. Europeans were able to build their own trade networks and exercise remarkable influence over much indigenous shipping. In East Asia, matters were different, but still revealing. China, Korea, and Japan all possessed organized states and the technological knowledge needed to build substantial ships and use artillery afloat. These states did employ naval force for coastal defense, anti-piracy operations, and regional war. Yet they generally showed little interest in developing seaborne power for sustained foreign projection. The great Chinese expeditions of the early 15th century were not continued. Korean naval innovation displayed impressive skill during the wars against Japan in the late 16th century, but it did not become the foundation of a long outward maritime strategy. Japan, after a period of energetic activity at sea, including raiding and large-scale operations against Korea, turned inward and restricted foreign contact. As a result, European maritime expansion met fewer organized external challenges on the open sea than it might otherwise have faced. Although European overseas power projection is the most dramatic feature of this age, most actual naval warfare still occurred in waters near Europe. That makes sense when the geography of the continent is considered. Europe is a great peninsula of the Eurasian landmass, full of smaller peninsulas, islands, archipelagos, enclosed seas, and long coastlines. A huge share of its population lived relatively close to the sea, and many of its most important economic and political centres were connected by water. Major European wars therefore often combined operations on land with struggles at sea, where supply routes, transport lines, amphibious landings, and naval support could be essential. The seas around Europe were also central to short and long-distance trade, and as global commerce expanded, the great European ports became the hubs of this wider maritime world. Because of that, war at sea took on a kind of double character. On one level, routine naval operations focused on commerce, attacking enemy trade, protecting friendly shipping, escorting convoys, raiding coasts, or disrupting communications. These actions were often carried out by relatively small groups of ships. On another level, navies served as instruments of power projection. Major expeditions across water demanded preparation, resources, and coordination on a much larger scale. Full-scale invasions of an enemy mainland, supported by fleets and armies together, were rare, but the possibility of such operations often shaped grand strategy. The fear of invasion across the Channel haunted English politics in the face of Spanish and later French threats. In the Baltic world, large amphibious invasions occurred more frequently, striking directly at major capitals and heartlands. Scandinavian and Baltic warfare repeatedly showed how fleets could transport armies, support campaigns, and shift the balance in a regional war. Seaborne power projection often took more limited forms than outright conquest of a major mainland. One common pattern was the strike against a peripheral but valuable target. A colony, an island, a port city, or a remote possession. Rich sugar islands in the Caribbean were obvious examples. In the Mediterranean, the capture of a city or island often became the focus of galley campaigns and amphibious assaults. Another pattern involved sudden attacks on important enemy ports or coastal regions, designed to burn, capture, or destroy before the defender could concentrate enough force to respond. Such raids became a familiar method in several European wars. A third pattern was the support of armies operating near coastlines or in overseas theatres. In these cases, naval logistics could prove decisive. A fleet that maintained supply and reinforcement might save an army. A fleet that failed could doom it. The collapse of one army in North America and the survival of others in Northern Europe both illustrate how the outcome of a campaign could depend less on what happened in battle than on whether maritime support held or broke. The distinction between trade warfare and power projection was often softened by a larger strategic aim: weakening or neutralizing enemy naval force. If that could be achieved, it would help both commerce raiding and the support of land operations. In theory, decisive fleet battles offered one route to that result. In practice, however, such battles usually occurred only when an outmatched fleet was compelled to fight by urgent necessity or by political pressure from leaders who did not fully understand the conditions at sea. Some of the most famous naval defeats in European history came about in exactly that way. An inferior fleet, sent out for reasons of prestige, desperation, or misunderstanding, met a stronger enemy in open water and paid the price. Blockade offered another method of neutralization. But close blockade was notoriously difficult. It required superiority in numbers, discipline, seamanship, and endurance, and even then, weather, darkness, shifting winds and fog might allow the trapped fleet to slip away. Ports such as Dunkirk demonstrated how hard it was to bottle up a skilled enemy completely. Over time, naval powers sometimes found it easier to impose broader strategic blockades, especially at choke points such as narrow straits. This mattered enormously because many vital supplies for naval warfare, including masts, timber, hemp, tar, and iron, came from specific regions. Control of access to these resources could weaken an enemy fleet before battle even began. Yet maritime war was never shaped by politics and economics alone. Climate, human endurance, and the limits of technology imposed constant restraints. These were not minor background factors. They defined what navies could do, when they could do it, and how long they could remain effective. Of these constraints, climate and human endurance remained fairly stable over centuries, while technology developed gradually as people tried to reduce their effects. The changes were important, but before the Industrial Age, they were usually evolutionary rather than revolutionary. The wider framework of naval warfare was therefore created through a long interaction between economic ambition, state power, and the practical realities of life at sea. Europe's unusual success in building a global system connected mainly by shipping rested on that interaction. Climate, in particular, shaped naval strategy in ways later generations often forgot. During the centuries before steam power, weather did not simply inconvenience fleets. It dictated the rhythm of war. In Western Europe, the period sometimes called the Little Ice Age brought somewhat altered wind patterns and more frequent storms from the later 16th century into the early 18th. Large fleets in the 16th and 17th centuries generally operated most safely during the summer. Attempts to keep major warships at sea too late into autumn often ended in wrecks, hardship, and disease. Only during the 18th century did improvements in ship design and rigging gradually make extended autumn and even winter operations more practical. Even then, such operations remained demanding and risky. Weather also shaped the map of strategic possibility. The harsh conditions of the North Atlantic long limited the scale and frequency of European power projection into that ocean, even while winds made the voyage from Europe to the Caribbean comparatively favourable. This partly explains why the West Indies became such a major theatre of operations. The Channel, the North Sea, and the Bay of Biscay were dangerous for much of the year, and although these waters were strategically vital, bad weather could restrict or entirely prevent major operations. Continuous blockade, so often imagined as a standard practice of maritime powers, was much harder before the later 18th century than later naval myth would suggest. In the Baltic, surprisingly long operational seasons were sometimes possible, perhaps because the interaction between fleet activity and amphibious warfare on land extended campaigns beyond what might otherwise have seemed safe. In warmer waters, other seasonal dangers took their place. Hurricanes ruled the calendar in the Caribbean, while monsoon patterns shaped movement in the Indian Ocean. In calmer seas, such as the Mediterranean, oared warships remained viable for much longer than in stormier northern waters. Since wind was the main engine of naval warfare, its direction and strength influenced everything from blockade strategy to tactical position in battle. Sailing technology improved steadily, but it never removed the basic vulnerability of fleets to weather and adverse winds. The human body imposed another limit. The endurance of a warship depended not only on its hull or sails, but on the health of the men who crewed it. Naval history can often be read as a long struggle against exhaustion, disease, spoiled provisions, and cramped conditions. Epidemics that existed in civilian society spread even faster aboard crowded ships. The first phase of a war was often especially dangerous because crews were drawn from many places and brought different infections with them. Men who survived became more resistant, but many did not survive long enough to benefit from that hardening process. In tropical regions, disease could become even more deadly when sailors lacked local immunity. Defenders familiar with the climate often enjoyed a major advantage over attacking forces newly arrived from Europe. Food posed another problem. Pre-industrial navies slowly improved the storage, packing, and handling of provisions for long voyages. But preserved food remained nutritionally poor. The lack of fresh produce meant that scurvy persisted as a serious threat even in the 18th century. Regular access to vegetables, fruit, and fresh supplies was one of the best protections, but this required careful logistics that were difficult to maintain over long distances. Until major changes in preservation and medical understanding during the 19th century, even the strongest fleet had to reckon with the possibility that disease and deficiency would destroy its effectiveness more surely than enemy action. The ship itself was the product of one of the most demanding technical traditions in the pre-industrial world. A gun-armed warship had to survive storms, carry heavy artillery, stay afloat after damage, move with sufficient speed, endure long voyages, and house a large crew in harsh conditions. European naval supremacy rested in part on continuous progress in solving these problems. Yet that progress happened within a firm material framework. Warships remained wooden. Their power came from sails or oars. Their guns were smoothbore weapons loaded by hand and firing solid shot. Boarding and close combat declined in importance over time, but never disappeared entirely, especially in encounters between smaller vessels. Within these limits, however, much changed. Hull forms improved, sail plans became more effective, rigs grew safer and more efficient, and design increasingly drew on theoretical and mathematical thinking by the end of the period. Artillery improved as well. In the later 15th century, cast bronze guns began replacing older constructions made from wrought iron bars. These newer guns could handle larger charges more safely and could do serious damage to large ships. The next major step came with reliable cast iron guns, which began to spread successfully in the 16th century and became especially important later because iron was far cheaper than bronze. This lowered the cost of arming ships on a large scale. Gun foundry methods improved. Powder became better and more consistent. Artillery thus grew more dependable and more destructive. As naval gunnery became stronger, warships also had to become tougher. Hulls needed thicker planking and stronger internal structures to resist shot and remain in action. This pushed up the size of ships intended for major fleet combat. A vessel that qualified as a major fighting ship in the mid-17th century would have looked modest compared with a battleship a century or two later. The line of battleship steadily grew larger, heavier, and more expensive as firepower increased. By the end of the period, the principal warships of the great fleets were massive structures carrying batteries far beyond what earlier generations had imagined practical. That very growth created another strategic problem. The largest fleet ships became highly specialized instruments of battle, but they were often too costly and cumbersome for the routine work that filled most of naval life. Scouting, convoy escort, policing sea lanes, protecting merchant traffic, and showing the flag across distant waters all demanded smaller, faster, and more flexible vessels. As European trade networks and colonial systems expanded around the world, the number of places requiring naval presence increased dramatically. This is why the age that produced the great battle fleet also produced growing numbers of lighter ships suited for cruising, escort, patrol, and imperial communication. Naval warfare was never only about the clash of great squadrons. It was also about endurance, reach, and the daily control of the routes that connected an increasingly maritime world. Across these 2 centuries, European naval warfare moved out of its medieval world and into something recognizably early modern. The transformation was not limited to ships or weapons alone. It involved a broad shift in where maritime power was exercised, how wars at sea were fought, and who controlled that violence. European activity spread far beyond the waters around the continent, reaching deep into the Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, and in more limited ways, the Pacific. Guns became the main instruments of fighting at sea, and warships were increasingly designed around artillery rather than around large bodies of armed men. At the same time, navies slowly took shape as more permanent institutions tied to states, rather than temporary flotillas assembled when war began. Within Europe itself, the centre of maritime struggle also changed. The Mediterranean, once the dominant theatre of naval conflict, gradually gave way to the Atlantic facade and the northern seas, where Western and Northern Europe became the new heart of naval development. The growing importance of artillery at sea altered naval warfare at a very deep level. Earlier fleets had depended heavily on manpower. Ships carried large numbers of fighting men because battle at sea often meant closing in, boarding, and turning a naval encounter into a clash between bodies of infantry. Once artillery became the main weapon, that balance changed. Capital investment in ships and guns began to matter more than simply loading a vessel with soldiers. This had enormous practical consequences. A fleet built around artillery could fight effectively without carrying such vast numbers of men, and that meant sailing warships could remain at sea longer and operate over far greater distances. Oceanic voyages and prolonged cruises became more realistic because ships no longer had to carry such massive supplies for enormous embarked armies. This change also reshaped strategy. In an earlier age, a fleet carrying an invasion force was dangerous, mainly because of the army it transported. A defending power could choose to stop that army at sea by sending out its own forces. But that was only one possible response, and often not the most attractive one. Many defenders preferred to wait on land, using strong ground, defensive positions, and the attacker's supply problems to wear down an invasion after it landed. Once gun-armed warships dominated the sea, the calculation shifted. A defender with a weaker army might now prefer to fight on water, where the enemy's larger land force could not easily bring its strength to bear. As infantry itself was becoming more central within armies on land, the reduced importance of infantry at sea made navies and armies into clearly distinct institutions. Even a navy that was weaker overall could still serve as a powerful deterrent to invasion, because army commanders were understandably reluctant to expose troops to attack, while still afloat unless enemy naval resistance had been clearly destroyed or tightly blockaded. In that sense, the sea had become an ideal zone for slowing, stopping, or discouraging invasion. This new kind of warship also made a new kind of institution attractive. Once specialized sailing ships carrying heavy artillery proved their value, rulers increasingly saw the benefit of maintaining forces permanently designed for violence at sea. A navy could break blockades or impose them, escort trade, harass enemy commerce, support amphibious attacks, prevent invasion, and serve the wider political goals of a state. For ambitious rulers, a permanent navy offered a fresh way to gain leverage over rivals both inside and outside their own realms. Earlier, a ruler's sea power had often meant little more than the ability to hire merchant vessels or seize them in wartime, then convert them into makeshift fighting ships with raised fighting platforms for archers or soldiers. But the move toward permanent navies did not happen evenly. In fact, two of the strongest powers in Western Europe, Spain and France, spent long periods without fully developed permanent sailing navies in the modern sense. Even where navies existed, they often depended heavily on regional interests and local elites, working with the crown rather than under a tightly unified central system. The first monarchies to create more continuous and centralized naval structures were not the largest states, but medium-sized kingdoms, such as Portugal, England, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Even then, private enterprise at sea remained vigorous. Armed trade, privateering, and other semi-private forms of maritime violence continued to thrive and took full advantage of the new possibilities created by guns and specialized ships. European maritime expansion widened dramatically in these centuries. Activity that had once been concentrated in the coastal waters of Europe now reached the Indian Ocean, the Atlantic Basin, and beyond. Portuguese ships and fortified stations became for, roughly a century, the only European presence in the Indian Ocean. Portuguese activity there had two closely linked goals. One was to force the trade in valuable Asian goods, above all spices, into routes controlled by Portugal around Africa. The other was to sell protection, using armed ships to extract payment from local shipping in exchange for restraint. Portuguese power rested not only on attack, but also on controlled intimidation. Around the year 1600, however, new challenges arrived. English and Dutch merchants entered the Indian Ocean determined to buy Asian goods directly, and by doing so they openly challenged Portuguese claims to monopoly in both trade and violence. This required a more effective fusion of commercial ambition, armed protection, and calculated aggression. The Dutch East India Company proved particularly capable of achieving that balance. In the 1620s and 1630s, it not only outcompeted the Portuguese in trade, but also defeated them in naval encounters. Until British power overtook it in the 18th century, the Dutch remained the main European force in the East Indies trade. The Spanish Empire in the Americas quickly attracted rivals, raiders, smugglers, and enemies. During the 16th century, French, English, and Dutch traders and freebooters entered the Caribbean, searching for commerce or plunder. In the early 17th century, they also began to settle there, especially on islands that became bases for more frequent attacks on Spanish shipping and colonial settlements. The lure was obvious. Treasure flowed regularly from the Americas to Spain, and many settlers in the Spanish colonies disliked the Crown's tight commercial monopoly. Spain responded by organizing much of its Atlantic trade into convoy systems. By the final decades of the 16th century, repeated attacks by English privateers and royal ships forced the Spanish monarchy to provide those convoys with stronger protection. Fortifications were also built throughout the Caribbean world to guard against seaborne attack. On the whole, the system succeeded in preserving the main trade routes. Only one treasure fleet was captured before the middle of the 17th century. Yet the cost of defending such an empire was immense and became a growing burden. During the 16th century, the Mediterranean still remained the central arena of large-scale naval conflict in Europe. Earlier centuries had already seen galley fleets, especially those of Italian maritime powers, fighting over trade routes and coastal territory. Venice preserved from that older world a permanent galley fleet and an infrastructure of bases to support it. Far from making galleys obsolete, early gunpowder actually helped prolong their usefulness. The great galley navies of the Mediterranean rowed increasingly by slaves and captives, chained to the oars, were in many ways products of the gunpowder age rather than relics of a pre-gunpowder past. Earlier galley fleets had often been assembled only for wartime and frequently rowed by free men. The gun gave the galley new offensive power. Its low hull could now carry a heavy forward-firing weapon capable of striking large sailing ships with high sides. Only gradually, as cheaper iron guns spread and naval artillery became more widespread and economical, did the galley become a less efficient platform. In the 16th century, however, a galley armed with a heavy gun and carrying a body of soldiers could still be a highly dangerous force against enemy ships and against the thin-walled coastal defences that had dominated much of the Mediterranean, before effective naval artillery became common. The sudden weakness of these older fortification systems helps explain the rapid rise of the Spanish and Ottoman maritime empires around the turn of the 16th century. From a naval point of view, both were sustained by the offensive and defensive value of the gun-armed galley, which could project deterrence and force across wide spaces. Although it lacked the endurance of sailing ships, a galley fleet, backed by a dense regional base system, was very effective in Mediterranean conditions. The Mediterranean struggle for power grew to imperial scale from the 1490s to the 1570s. Before, during, and after those decades, the sea also remained a place of constant smaller violence. Piracy, privateering, raids, extortion, and local predation. Much of this was tied to the larger conflict between Christian and Muslim powers, with Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, and the Knights of St. John standing out as especially persistent centres of hostility. But violence was not confined to that religious frontier. Christian powers and communities also preyed on one another. Raids by Adriatic groups against Venetian commerce and attacks by Christian privateers on fellow Christians trading with Muslim ports show how widespread this semi-official violence remained. For some Mediterranean coastal societies, extorting wealth by threat or force remained a way of life long after many Northern Europeans had shifted similar practices outward toward the wider world. The major regular wars of the Mediterranean involved four principal powers: the Habsburg system in Spain and Italy, the Ottoman Empire, France and Venice, smaller Italian states, and the Order of St. John, first at Rhodes and later at Malta, usually fought alongside the Habsburg side. Italian naval entrepreneurs also played important roles, especially the powerful Genoese families, who provided ships and expertise. In the Western Mediterranean, the struggle for empire began with the unification of Spain, the conquest of Granada, Spanish expansion into North Africa, and intervention against French ambitions in Italy. These developments set the pattern for decades. Spain and France repeatedly fought each other in large European wars, while Spain also had to face Ottoman expansion across North Africa. Algiers became a critical centre of this struggle after Turkish adventurers seized it and turned it into a major naval base. Under the formidable leadership of Barbarossa, Ottoman forces operated widely in the Western Mediterranean and even cooperated with France against the Habsburgs in certain periods. There were relatively few great set-piece naval battles in these waters, but there were many major amphibious operations. In the Eastern Mediterranean, Ottoman expansion after the fall of Constantinople was followed by a long process of pressure and conquest directed against remaining Christian territories. As Ottoman power grew rapidly in the early 16th century, it created a degree of strategic stability that had not existed before. Venice, though still famed as a naval republic, had become highly dependent on trade with ports that were now under Ottoman control. For that reason, it generally preferred peace when possible and fought only when direct attack made war unavoidable. When war did come, the Ottomans won important successes. One early encounter already revealed how difficult it could be to coordinate galleys with gun-armed sailing ships. Later, another major battle off western Greece showed that even a Christian fleet enjoying numerical superiority could be defeated by stronger Ottoman seamanship and tactical skill. Ottoman ability to operate far into the Western Mediterranean owed something to divisions among Christian states, but it also reflected real superiority in handling fleets. After peace between France and Spain in the middle of the century, Habsburg Spain could devote more energy to the Mediterranean. Its first great effort ended badly when an expedition aimed at Tripoli was intercepted and shattered near Djerba. This was an early and clear example of a defender using naval power to destroy an amphibious enterprise before it could succeed. The next enormous confrontation came when the Ottomans attacked Malta. The siege became legendary, but the assault failed after desperate defence and the arrival of relief. Ottoman seizure of Cyprus then prompted a Christian coalition under Habsburg leadership. The fleets met at Lepanto, where an extraordinary number of men were brought together, making it the largest European battle of its kind before the later 17th century. The Christian victory was overwhelming in tactical terms, yet its wider strategic effect was limited. Venice ultimately accepted the loss of Cyprus, and the Ottomans soon showed their resilience by rebuilding and continuing the struggle. A city retaken by Christian forces was soon recovered by an Ottoman fleet, even larger than the one lost at Lepanto. After this, the direct Spanish-Ottoman confrontation faded and was never truly resumed at the same level. Spain did provide aid to its Austrian relatives when war against the Ottomans revived in Central Europe, but that aid was mainly naval demonstration rather than decisive intervention. The central importance of the galley fleet in this long rivalry becomes especially clear when it is remembered that Spain and the Ottoman Empire, the two greatest military powers of the period, never fought a major land battle against each other. Their struggle was above all a contest between seaborne powers, fought through fleets, sieges, amphibious attacks, and maritime logistics. Later historians, more accustomed to oceanic sailing warfare or purely continental campaigns, have sometimes found this difficult to categorize, but it was one of the defining military realities of the 16th century. Farther north, the Baltic and North Sea world underwent its own transformation. The Hanseatic League, once a powerful alliance of trading cities able to defend its interests with force, gradually dissolved as an effective military cartel. Its cities increasingly relied on the protection and agreements of monarchies such as England, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Lübeck remained the last major Hanseatic city, still trying to act as a great naval power in order to preserve control over Baltic trade. Early in the 16th century, it could still send fleets capable of influencing the struggle for power in Scandinavia. But its attempt in the 1530s to control the entrance to the Baltic, through intervention in a Danish civil war, ended in failure. During the later war between Sweden and Denmark, Lübeck fought on the Danish side, but no longer as an equal force, and it achieved none of its commercial aims. That marked the final major German naval effort for centuries. The Baltic increasingly became a sea open to foreign merchants, but watched over by the Scandinavian crowns, which claimed the right to maintain the region's only significant navies. In this world, the Danish kings had already built a navy in the 15th century, and command of the sea remained a major advantage in their recurring wars with Sweden. From the 1520s, a new Swedish dynasty also began creating a gun-armed navy capable of controlling sea routes in the northern Baltic. That navy intervened in the Danish Civil War and won at least one important action, largely through gunfire. During the major war between Denmark, Lübeck, and Sweden in the 1560s, the Swedish fleet proved successful in breaking blockades, preventing invasion and securing communications within the emerging Swedish Baltic Empire. That conflict can reasonably be described as the first truly modern naval war in the region. Permanent sailing navies faced each other, guns served as the main weapon in repeated fleet battles, and the concentrated operations of battle fleets became the central feature of the struggle. Later wars between Denmark and Sweden again showed how important control of the sea had become. In one case, Danish forces quickly crippled ships still in harbour. In another, a Swedish fleet victory late in the season gave Stockholm control over Danish waters themselves. In Western Europe, by contrast, naval warfare remained surprisingly underdeveloped until the later 16th century. France, Spain, England, Scotland, and the Burgundian Netherlands fought repeated wars over land, dynastic rights, and political dominance. But their maritime operations often remained limited and old-fashioned in spirit. Troops were transported by sea, coasts were raided, and trade was attacked in irregular fashion, but there were few serious fleet actions. Even large expeditions across the Channel or toward Brittany and France passed without major naval contests. A force at sea was still widely assumed to be secure unless confronted by a superior army afloat. By the mid-16th century, France and England both possessed permanent gun-armed fleets and experimented with combining sailing ships and galleys, yet their clashes in the Channel proved inconclusive. Wind, coordination problems, and the difficulty of mixing different types of ships frustrated serious results. The Dutch revolt against Spain changed all of this. From the beginning, the struggle was deeply maritime. Dutch forces quickly gained local control over inland waterways and nearby coastal waters. Spanish attempts to send fleets northward were delayed or frustrated by commitments elsewhere, by lack of preparation, by the absence of a proper deep-water base in the Netherlands, and by growing English hostility backed by a well-organised navy. When Spain finally launched its great northern enterprise, it did so with a force that combined permanent elements with many armed merchant vessels. In conception, it was still essentially an invasion expedition in the older style, despite being organised by the most advanced bureaucratic state of its time. The Armada was defeated by stronger English gunnery, by the lack of a suitable channel base, and by unusually bad weather. For one of the first times, a gun-armed navy had defeated a much larger invading force before it could land. Yet this was not the end of Spanish sea power. In the decade that followed, Spain recovered at sea, and English efforts to strike decisively at Spanish trade and colonies mostly failed. England's maritime state and merchant world were not yet strong or coordinated enough for a sustained offensive struggle against Iberian Empire. Instead, the first half of the 17th century witnessed something even larger: the world's first truly global maritime war, fought between Habsburg Spain, still linked with Portugal until 1640, and the Dutch Republic. In its second major phase, this war was especially a struggle over trade and over the routes connecting Europe with Asia and the Americas. By then, the Dutch had become Europe's leading commercial nation. Spain hoped to weaken them through embargoes and aggressive attacks on shipping in northern waters, around Iberia, and if possible, even in the Baltic. The Dutch answered with convoy systems in European seas and with large commercial military expeditions to the East and West Indies. Chartered companies sought profit, but they also waged war. They attacked enemy trade, struck at colonies, and built commercial and territorial footholds of their own. Spain and Portugal had to dispatch major expeditions to the Caribbean and Brazil to defend their possessions. The 1630s in particular proved disastrous for the Habsburg overseas system, and the pressure on Portuguese interests contributed to Portugal's break from Spanish rule. The overall outcome of this long war was complex. Dutch trade in Europe suffered, though the degree remains debatable, but it survived and recovered. Overseas, the Dutch triumphed in the East Indies, while the Portuguese eventually recovered in the Atlantic and retook Brazil after regaining independence. Spain's American empire remained intact, yet the cost of defending it grew ever heavier and deepened the wider crisis of Spanish power. In Europe, the naval struggle climaxed late in the 1630s. France, newly active at sea, entered the war against Spain and sought direct fleet victory rather than the commercial strategy favoured by the Dutch. It defeated a smaller Spanish squadron near the northern coast of Spain. In response, Spain risked a major concentration of force in northern waters. The resulting campaign ended in one of the most decisive fleet disasters of the sailing age. Much of the Hispanic fleet was destroyed or captured after it failed to break through and then found itself trapped. The defeat was more conclusive in practical terms than the better-remembered disaster of 1588, and it fed the deep political crisis that engulfed Habsburg Spain in the following decade. From the middle of the 17th century into the early 18th, the dominant trend was the rise of large permanent navies organised on increasingly bureaucratic lines. Around 1650, the main European naval powers together possessed fleets of significant but still limited size. Within 50 years, the total tonnage of these fleets had multiplied dramatically. New powers joined the ranks of major sailing ship states, and established ones expanded their fleets at astonishing speed. This growth enabled European governments to enforce much more effectively their claim to a monopoly over maritime violence in European waters. The strongest Western fleets could now enter the Baltic or the Mediterranean in force, deter opponents, support allies, and protect trade on a scale no earlier power had managed. The new battle fleets also ended the old practice of renting temporary warships from merchants. Naval tactics became more formalised, culminating in the line of battle system, which suited large, centralised states and their disciplined organisations. Permanent officer corps emerged, and governments devised systems for recruiting sailors in great numbers when war came. Privateering continued, but under tighter control. Piracy and unofficial violence declined in European waters, though dangers persisted in some other regions. This naval expansion was driven by rivalry among states. Repeated wars and constant mistrust pushed governments to integrate politically and financially behind stronger armed forces. At sea, one of the clearest early examples of an arms race without serious retrenchment came in the succession of wars between England and the Dutch Republic. The First War joined commercial rivalry to internal political instability in both states. It was fought over regulations, access to trade, and the need of new regimes to prove themselves. The second followed the restoration of monarchy in England and reflected the Crown's hope that a profitable and successful war would strengthen royal authority at home. The third was similar in spirit, though now England fought as the junior partner of an aggressive France using both a large army and a growing battle fleet. These Anglo-Dutch wars were marked by repeated major fleet battles in the North Sea and the Channel. Their intensity reflected the fact that they were being fought at the very centre of European and world trade, where every convoy, blockade and delay involved immense value. In the First War, England prevailed thanks to greater firepower and larger purpose-built warships. The rise of a major French navy in the 1660s came from the monarchy's growing ability to impose order at home and convert internal stability into power abroad. France's main target before 1700 was Habsburg Spain, whose possessions in Italy and the Low Countries seemed vulnerable to pressure from land and sea together. In the earlier war that ended in the late 1650s, both France and Spain had become weak at sea. But by the 1660s, Spain could do little to stop the growth of French maritime strength. This was deeply troubling to those determined to prevent France from dominating Western Europe. In the War of the 1670s, Spain received Dutch naval support. In the much larger war beginning in 1688, England and the Dutch fought together to preserve the political settlement in Britain, defend their trade, and keep the Spanish Empire in Europe out of French hands. France initially hoped to restore the deposed James to the British throne, and this led to a series of major fleet battles. When that effort failed, French policy shifted toward commerce warfare, relying on squadrons and privateers to attack the vast trade of its enemies. Meanwhile, the Allied maritime powers pushed into the Mediterranean to support their continental partners, and naval warfare became deeply tied to the logistics of war on land. The conflict ended without decisive victory, and France remained formidable at sea. The War of the Spanish Succession changed the situation again. A Bourbon prince now inherited Spain, and the conflict became a struggle over whether France and Spain would be united under one dynastic system, or whether the Austrian Habsburgs could claim the empire instead. The war on land spread across the Low Countries, Germany, Italy, and Spain, while the navies of England and the Dutch Republic maintained immense logistical networks and supported campaigns in coastal theatres. France, at first, tried to control the Mediterranean, but after one major battle produced no decisive result. It abandoned hopes of contesting battle fleet supremacy there. From then on, France emphasised commerce raiding and did so with determination. It also continued, often with Spanish financing, to protect the transport of bullion from the Americas. War at sea increasingly resembled attrition, just as war on land did. In the end, peace came through compromise. The Bourbon dynasty kept Spain, while the Habsburgs received former Spanish territories in Italy and the Low Countries. France's navy, however, had been severely damaged, and that weakness helped make peace acceptable to the maritime powers. Fighting did not quite end there, since Spain soon tried with a rebuilt navy to recover influence in Italy, only to suffer defeat at sea. The long Venetian-Ottoman wars of the same period remain less familiar, yet they were highly important. These conflicts were fought not mainly for trade, as earlier struggles had been, but for territory, strategic islands and coastal positions in Greece and the Adriatic world. Venice, no longer the dominant long-distance trading power it had once been, fought increasingly as a regional state, drawing resources from land as well as sea. The Ottoman side, too, committed heavily to these contests, since control of Greece mattered for the security of both Constantinople and the Ottoman position in the eastern Mediterranean. In the long war over Crete, the Ottomans eventually succeeded in conquest after years of struggle. Naval operations centered on the Greek archipelago, and Venice could at times threaten the Dardanelles. Galleys were now complemented by sailing warships, many of them hired from northern Europe. In the next Great War, Venice joined a wider anti-Ottoman coalition and managed to seize the Peloponnese, which it retained at peace. By the Third Major War, however, the Ottomans were able to concentrate more fully on Venice and recovered their earlier losses. In all of these wars, Venice repeatedly brought its main fleet into the waters of the Aegean, close to the Ottoman heartland, but translating that presence into an effective blockade or decisive strategic pressure remained difficult. Even so, that threat alone may help explain why the Ottoman state continued to fight so hard for Greece. Meanwhile, Sweden and Denmark kept renewing their old struggle for control in the Baltic. These wars often began when Denmark tried to exploit Swedish entanglement elsewhere in Europe and recover previously lost territory. Sea and land warfare were tightly linked in every case. The real strategic prize was control over the lines of communication connecting Jutland, the Danish islands, Scania, and northern Germany, all areas central to power in the Baltic, and, by extension, much of northern Europe. The fleet that dominated these lines could move troops, sustain armies, and shape the whole course of the war. To improve its position in this strategic zone, Sweden eventually relocated its fleet to a new base at Karlskrona. The wars of the late 17th and early 18th centuries also drew outside naval powers into the Baltic. Dutch and English fleets intervened, sometimes to restrain a stronger side, sometimes to protect trade and political balance. In one war, Swedish success and even a severe winter allowed astonishing gains against Denmark. In the next stage of that conflict, Dutch intervention prevented Swedish expansion from becoming overwhelming. In a later war, Sweden's fleet suffered repeated defeats, but French support and the threat of French intervention in the Baltic prevented Denmark from fully exploiting its victories. Then, in 1700, when Denmark joined a coalition attacking Sweden, the Swedish navy, working with an Anglo-Dutch squadron, gained naval superiority and landed an army near Copenhagen, forcing Denmark quickly out of the war. Denmark returned later when Sweden's main field army was destroyed in the east. For several more years, the Swedish and Danish fleets continued to fight, but by then, neither could act with the offensive freedom they had once possessed. The age in which Baltic war had been dominated by their rivalry alone was drawing to a close. Russia entered the world of naval power later than most European states, yet its rise at sea was strikingly rapid. The first serious attempt came during wars with the Ottoman Empire in the final years of the 17th century. During that struggle, the Russian state built a fleet in the Sea of Azov in order to challenge Ottoman control in the region. The effort was ambitious, but the fleet's existence proved fragile. After a later defeat in another war against the Ottomans, the Russian navy in that southern theatre had to be dismantled in 1711 as part of the peace settlement. Russia's more dramatic maritime breakthrough occurred not in the south but in the Baltic. Tsar Peter I entered the anti-Swedish coalition with a clear strategic objective. Russia needed access to the sea and a navy capable of operating there. These goals were also tied to a broader ambition. Peter sought to transform Russia into a modern state, and maritime power was a crucial part of that vision. After early failures, Russian forces managed to secure a foothold along the Baltic coast. On this newly conquered ground, the city of St. Petersburg was founded, giving Russia its long-desired window onto the sea. From 1710 onward, Peter launched a determined naval building program. Within a decade, Russia possessed the largest battle fleet in the Baltic. The fleet's appearance was impressive, yet it was also clear that it remained inexperienced. Many sailors lacked training, and a large share of the officer corps consisted of foreign specialists. The Tsar himself understood the limitations of this new navy and acted cautiously when comparing its capabilities with those of older maritime powers. Even so, the achievement was remarkable. For the first time, the European model of a bureaucratically organized battle fleet had been successfully transplanted into a state that previously had little connection with maritime traditions and no powerful seafaring interest groups. It showed how far determined state power could go in creating naval strength where none had existed before. In the actual fighting against Sweden during the 1710s, however, another type of force played an even more decisive role. Russia's galley fleet proved vital in the conquest of Finland. The large sailing fleet remained mostly cautious and avoided decisive combat on its own. In 1716, it joined Danish and British naval forces in a projected invasion of Scania, an operation linked to the interests of Hanover within the anti-Swedish coalition. Yet the expedition never took place. Peter cancelled the plan before the attack could begin. In the final stage of the war, between 1719 and 1721, Russian strategy turned to coastal pressure. Galley squadrons raided along the Swedish coast, striking settlements and demonstrating Russia's growing reach. British and Swedish fleets cooperated in attempts to counter this pressure. But without powerful armies ready to land, naval operations alone could accomplish little. By the end of the conflict, the strategic situation had changed permanently. Russia had secured its position as a Baltic power and established the foundations of a maritime empire in the north. The century that followed witnessed the height of warfare fought by sailing fleets. It was also the period during which Great Britain rose from the level of a strong European kingdom to the position of a global maritime superpower. Naval strength and commercial expansion formed the core of this transformation. Large battle fleets became highly effective tools for projecting force across oceans and for controlling the sea routes that connected Europe with the rest of the world. Major armies and fleets were increasingly dispatched overseas to fight for dominance in North America and on the Indian subcontinent. Possession of distant territories became an essential issue in European politics. Maritime strategy and naval presence in remote waters gained new importance as states prepared for further expansion. In terms of global strategy, the scale of naval rivalry during this era would not be matched again until the 20th century. The enormous growth of European naval forces was supported by strong political and economic foundations. States invested heavily in fleets because maritime trade was expanding rapidly, and because control of that trade promised enormous wealth. Economic growth provided resources that had been scarce in earlier generations. Governments and commercial groups increasingly saw naval power as essential to national success. During this same period, European politics gradually divided into two broad spheres of conflict. One was largely continental. In that arena, Austria, Prussia, and Russia competed for influence, while Sweden and the Ottoman Empire occupied important positions on the margins. These struggles occasionally involved maritime operations, because regions such as the Baltic, the Black Sea, and parts of the Mediterranean allowed naval power to influence campaigns on land. Russia's wars with Sweden and the Ottoman Empire often brought naval forces into play. When Russia and Austria fought the Ottomans during the late 1730s, Russia attempted to gain access to the Black Sea. Despite constructing a large river flotilla to assist its army, the effort failed. A few years later, Sweden attempted to regain territory lost to Russia. The campaign ended in defeat, partly because disease devastated the Swedish fleet and because the navy hesitated to support the army's flank in Finland. Another conflict erupted when the Ottoman Empire attacked Russia in the late 1760s. Russia responded in an unexpected way. A naval expedition sailed from the Baltic all the way to the Mediterranean, where Russian forces destroyed the Ottoman fleet in a major battle in 1770. The war concluded with Russia conquering Crimea and building a new fleet in the Black Sea. During the following decade, Russia greatly expanded its naval strength. Plans were drawn up for a major war that would strike the Ottoman Empire from both the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, potentially dividing large parts of the Balkans between Russia and Austria. The conflict that followed in 1787 produced several years of fighting in the Black Sea. Russian naval forces performed well, although they were not overwhelmingly superior to their Ottoman opponents. At this moment, another power unexpectedly intervened. Sweden attacked Russia in 1788, hoping that Britain and Prussia might soon join the conflict. The Swedish attack forced Russia to abandon its planned Mediterranean expedition. Instead, the Baltic fleet had to defend St. Petersburg against amphibious assaults launched from Sweden. A series of engagements between 1788 and 1790 ended with significant losses for the Swedish battle fleet. Russia then attempted to strike back against Swedish-owned forces operating in the Finnish archipelago. But the attack failed and resulted in heavy Russian losses. This confrontation was historically significant. It marked the last large naval battle anywhere in the world in which fleets of oared warships played a central role. While continental conflicts involved several naval episodes, the most dramatic maritime rivalry of the 18th century unfolded across the oceans. In the Atlantic world and in Asian waters, the main competitors were Great Britain, France, and Spain. Portugal and the Netherlands tried to remain neutral when possible, although neutrality proved difficult to maintain during prolonged conflicts. The three great maritime powers expanded their fleets steadily. Each sought to protect existing overseas interests, while also gaining new territories. The first major clashes in this rivalry occurred between Britain and Spain. Britain launched a war in 1739, claiming that Spanish authorities had interfered with British trade. Large British expeditions sailed toward the Caribbean, though their achievements were limited. A few years later, France joined the struggle against Britain. British forces and colonial militias captured several French territories in North America, while the British fleet, strengthened by new construction, inflicted losses on French naval escorts, protecting merchant convoys. Nevertheless, French successes in European land warfare balanced the situation, and peace was reached without a decisive outcome. After the middle of the century, tensions escalated again. Colonial disputes merged with a wider war that engulfed Europe. Britain and Prussia formed one alliance while France supported their continental opponents. Britain focused its efforts on attacking French colonial possessions in Canada, the Caribbean, and India. The British Navy already held an advantage at sea, and a massive shipbuilding program strengthened that position further. A decisive victory in a major fleet battle near the French coast crippled French naval power overseas. French colonies were left isolated, and the French presence in North America and India collapsed. Spain entered the conflict near its end, but suffered heavy losses. British amphibious expeditions captured both Havana and Manila, demonstrating the effectiveness of Britain's naval and logistical system for launching rapid attacks across great distances. Even so, the struggle for maritime supremacy was far from finished. France and Spain formed a close alliance and began ambitious naval construction programs. When Britain's North American colonies revolted in the 1770s, the Bourbon powers had already strengthened their fleets considerably. When they joined the conflict, their combined naval strength posed a serious challenge to Britain. For a short time, the Allied fleets gained control of the English Channel. Meanwhile, the French Navy fought the British in the Caribbean and along the American coast. Colonies changed hands several times, and naval battles produced no clear decision. Britain was unable to prevent French ships from delivering troops and supplies to the American rebels. When French naval forces helped isolate the main British army in North America, the campaign ended in a decisive surrender. British political leaders soon concluded that continuing the war against the colonies was futile. Yet Britain still retained formidable naval strength. Its shipbuilding capacity allowed the fleet to recover quickly. A major French fleet was defeated in the Caribbean a year later, ending the possibility of further large conquests. The peace agreement reached in the early 1780s did not end the underlying competition. European governments immediately began preparing for new maritime conflicts. France and Spain continued to expand their navies in anticipation of future struggles over colonial trade and overseas influence. By the early 1790s, the combined size of the major sailing fleets reached its greatest level in history. Britain also expanded its fleet while looking beyond Atlantic rivalry toward the growing influence of Russia in the south. This emerging concern would later evolve into the strategic rivalry often described as the struggle for influence in Asia. Smaller states were also building fleets, though for more limited purposes. Some prepared for regional conflicts, while others hoped to defend existing colonial possessions. Then, events took an unexpected turn. Instead of another colonial war, Europe plunged into a vast struggle triggered by the French Revolution. From the early 1790s until 1815, the continent was dominated by wars that reshaped the balance of power. On land, the French armies achieved remarkable success, defeating nearly every major continental opponent. At sea, the situation unfolded very differently. Britain gained an early advantage over the disorganized French fleet and held that advantage throughout the conflict. British naval organization, financial strength, and technological improvements proved decisive. British ships often carried artillery produced with superior manufacturing techniques, giving them greater destructive power. Equally important was the Navy's ability to remain at sea for long periods and to operate effectively in harsh conditions. French naval power suffered severe blows. Parts of the Mediterranean fleet were destroyed during internal unrest in France, and a later expedition to Egypt lost most of its ships in a devastating battle. Spain and the Netherlands, drawn into the conflict by French victories on land, also saw their naval forces weakened. With its rivals weakened, Britain was able to seize colonial territories and dominate many sea routes. It even forced a group of neutral northern powers to abandon their attempt to resist British naval pressure. A brief peace followed at the beginning of the 19th century, but tensions quickly revived. Napoleon hoped to rebuild French naval strength and threaten Britain again. In response, Britain resumed the war and blockaded French ports. Napoleon attempted to assemble a combined French and Spanish fleet, strong enough to escort an invasion of Britain across the Channel. The plan failed. In a decisive naval battle, the combined fleet was destroyed, eliminating the possibility of invasion. During the decade that followed, there were few great naval battles, yet the struggle at sea continued in other forms. Napoleon began a vast shipbuilding program that might eventually have produced a massive fleet. Britain responded with an equally large effort, while maintaining powerful squadrons blockading ports across Europe. The intensity of the rivalry led to extraordinary actions. Britain even attacked a neutral state in order to capture its fleet before it could fall under French control. At the same time, British forces steadily dismantled the colonial empires of France and the Netherlands. In American waters, the small United States Navy achieved several successes against British cruisers during a later conflict. But these encounters had little effect on the wider struggle. Britain's global strength had become so overwhelming that the war in North America was treated largely as a secondary theatre compared with the immense conflict raging across Europe. Naval operations also played a role in the Baltic and Mediterranean regions during this period. Russian fleets sailed in support of campaigns connected with territorial expansion and European alliances. In the Mediterranean, a Russian squadron defeated Ottoman forces after the Ottoman Empire entered the war on the French side. When Russia conquered Finland in the early 19th century, winter conditions shaped the campaign on land. Yet control of key naval bases and archipelago flotillas made it difficult for Swedish fleets to support counterattacks along the coast. By the end of the long wars that stretched from the early 1790s to 1815, the balance of power at sea had shifted dramatically. Britain emerged with clear naval superiority. The competition that had been expected to determine control over world trade and colonial expansion had effectively been settled in European waters. Britain's dominance of maritime communication routes linking Europe with the wider world became the foundation of its global influence. This supremacy did not rest on naval strength alone. Financial power, commercial networks, and the beginnings of industrial expansion reinforced Britain's position. Yet control of the sea was the central pillar supporting this system. It had taken centuries of development in shipbuilding, naval organization, and maritime strategy to reach that point. Once achieved, however, it allowed Britain to remain the leading power in global politics for the next 100 years. In the middle of the 15th century, Japan stood close to political collapse. The emperor still lived in Kyoto and remained the sacred source of legitimacy, but real authority had long since passed into other hands. Since the late 12th century, power had belonged not to the court but to warrior governments, led by military rulers. The first of these governments had been established in the east, in the Kamakura region, and later, another military regime emerged in Kyoto under the Ashikaga family. Although this later warrior government placed itself near the emperor and claimed to govern in his name, its actual control over the country was always fragile. The Ashikaga order was born in violence and never fully escaped it. It emerged in the 14th century during a bitter civil conflict and, even after that war ended, its power remained uneven and incomplete. The military ruler in Kyoto stood at the top of a loose order of provincial warrior lords, but many parts of Japan lay beyond effective control. Far western regions, remote northern districts, and even the strategically crucial eastern provinces slipped in and out of obedience. By the 15th century, central authority had already weakened badly. Then, in the conflict that erupted in the late 1460s, that fragile order nearly broke apart altogether. The civil war that followed dragged the country into an age of near-permanent violence, remembered as the era when the whole land seemed to be at war. The causes of that breakdown were not simple, but the heart of the problem lay in a failing balance between the central warrior government and the provincial military families that supposedly served it. Many of these provincial governors had been appointed to territories where they had no deep roots. They arrived as outsiders expected to rule from above, often over warriors and landholders, who saw them as strangers. Their economic foundations were weak because real wealth still depended on control over agricultural land, especially rice production, and their local authority depended on persuading or coercing regional fighters into becoming loyal supporters. This was a difficult task even in the best circumstances. By the middle of the 15th century, it was becoming unmanageable. Several of the leading warrior houses were already torn by internal succession disputes. Rival claimants fought over inheritance, and local warriors took sides, often using these disputes as opportunities to strengthen their own position. The crisis deepened when the ruling military house itself fell into a succession quarrel. The shogun wished to retire young and had first arranged for his brother to succeed him. But when his wife gave birth to a son, a new faction formed at court to support the child instead. Two of the strongest military magnates in the country, already bitter rivals, took opposite sides not only in this dispute, but also in the quarrels of other great families. The ruling shogun hesitated and changed direction instead of imposing a clear settlement. That indecision made the situation worse. In the first month of 1467, violence broke out near Kyoto, between rival claimants backed by these powerful houses, and the country was pushed into a destructive conflict that soon spread far beyond the capital. Although the war is often treated as a conflict limited to roughly a decade, that is only partly true. The fiercest early phase was indeed concentrated in Kyoto, where the opposing armies established great encampments on different sides of the city and fought in and around the capital. But from the beginning, the struggle spread outward into the provinces, and once the major armies left Kyoto, the violence did not end. It simply merged with the regional and local warfare that continued for generations. In that sense, the conflict was less a short civil war than the beginning of a much longer age of fragmentation. To understand that later age, it helps to look back at how warfare had worked in earlier Japan, From the late first millennium onward, war had increasingly become the domain of a warrior elite. These fighters often still depended on agriculture and local landholding, but they were set apart by their role as trained military specialists. Their elite status rested on two things above all: mounted combat and mastery of the bow. Fighting from horseback required money, equipment, and long practice. A warrior needed a horse, armour, weapons, and years of training to shoot effectively while riding. Because of that, warfare remained for a long time the preserve of men with resources and status. The ideal warrior was an equestrian archer, and that image retained its prestige for centuries, even after the realities of war began to change. This military culture developed within a wider social order built around ties between lord and vassal. In theory, these bonds were supposed to resemble the relationship of parent and child. A lord protected and favoured his retainers, and the vassal repaid that protection with complete devotion, even to the point of death. In stories of war, this ideal was celebrated again and again. Yet the actual history of conflict tells a harsher story. Loyalty was real, but so were betrayal, ambition, and shifting self-interest. By the age of civil war, the gap between ideal and reality had grown enormous. Retainers changed sides, rebelled, and abandoned their masters with shocking frequency. In time, acts of disloyalty became so common that they threatened the whole fabric of warrior society. Earlier, Japanese warfare had also been deeply individualistic. Armies were usually small, often only a few hundred or a few thousand at most. Battles opened with exchanges of arrows as mounted warriors rode toward one another. Once the distance closed, fighting often became a series of personal encounters. Warriors tried to unhorse opponents, then finish them on the ground. The taking of heads as trophies played a central role in the reward system of war. After battle, the heads of slain enemies were examined to determine who deserved land, promotion, or favour. Since warriors fought partly for recognition and reward, individual acts of bravery carried enormous weight. There is still debate over how important common foot soldiers were in that early period. Mounted fighters certainly brought attendants into the field, and some of those attendants may have done more than care for horses and collect trophies. In the sources and in later visual depictions, men on foot appear carrying polearms, swords, bows, and other weapons. Whether they played a central combat role in the earliest age or not, by the great wars of the late 12th century, foot soldiers had clearly become more prominent. That conflict, which established the first warrior government, expanded warfare dramatically. Armies became far larger than before, and although elite mounted warriors still dominated the written accounts. The available manpower of the warrior class alone could not possibly have filled the ranks of these much larger forces. Increasing numbers of common fighters must have taken part. That expansion of warfare also brought a loosening of earlier conventions. Some old narratives describe battle as if it followed orderly rules, with prior arrangements, ritual openings, and formal exchanges. Yet even in earlier times, surprise attacks, ambushes, and arson were already common. Once warfare expanded, such methods became even more important. Many of the practices that later writers condemned as dishonourable or chaotic were associated especially with men fighting on foot. They shot at horses rather than riders, dragged mounted men down with hooked weapons, and blocked roads to create easy targets. These were effective methods, even if elite ideals treated them with contempt. Even so, mounted warriors remained the decisive arm for a long time. It was not until the 14th century, during another prolonged era of civil conflict, that armies increasingly came to be built around large masses of infantry. A new preference for the spear spread among foot soldiers. though they still used bows, swords, and other polearms. At the same time, warfare grew rougher and less orderly. Bands of armed men emerged who were viewed by contemporaries as dangerous outlaws, particularly in the central and western provinces. They specialized in raiding, burning, plunder, and fighting in broken terrain. They were highly effective in mountainous country and played a major role in the development of rough, defensive strongholds in hard-to-reach places. These earlier forts were very different from the great castles that later came to symbolize Japanese warfare. The grand stone fortresses admired by European visitors appeared only toward the end of the 16th century, after the age of fragmentation was already ending. Earlier fortifications were often practical, improvised, and closely tied to the natural terrain. Mountain ridges, steep slopes, and narrow approaches did much of the defensive work. Even in the civil wars of the 14th and 15th centuries, many strongholds were simple in structure. Their value lay not in monumental architecture, but in defensibility. Siege warfare could be fierce, but forts were often treated less as places for final heroic stands than as temporary tools in a shifting war. A commander usually wanted a route of escape. If the situation turned hopeless, he preferred negotiation or withdrawal. If no escape remained, surrender was often avoided in favor of ritual suicide. Honor demanded death on one's own terms rather than capture. This mentality shaped the meaning of fortified places long before the later Castle Age. When the Great Civil War broke out in Kyoto in 1467, it opened a new phase in this long military evolution. The war's most active years in the capital lasted from 1467 to 1473. After the deaths of the two principal commanders, the conflict in the city hardened into something closer to a stalemate. Rather than tracing every skirmish, it is more revealing to look at the kind of fighter who came to symbolize the war's destructive character. The Ashigaru, the light-foot soldiers. These men were in some ways heirs to the lawless bands of the earlier age, but unlike those older groups, which included mounted men as well, the Ashigaru were infantry alone. Because both sides in the war used them, they could not easily be dismissed as mere outlaws. Yet many people in Kyoto saw them exactly that way. To members of the courtly elite, they seemed like a terrifying force of social breakdown, something almost beneath the level of civilized humanity. Later, the term Ashigaru would become respectable and refer to trained infantry serving organized lords. During the Kyoto War, however, these men were feared above all as agents of chaos. They were recruited from commoners in the city and from nearby rural districts. Contemporary descriptions present them as astonishingly fast, almost flying through the streets. Some had bits of armor, but many were poorly dressed, lightly equipped, and looked more like desperate opportunists than disciplined soldiers. Yet to many younger men they were attractive figures, energetic and daring, and as the war continued more and more sought to join them. They carried different weapons, especially spears and polearms, and fought in an urban style that resembled guerrilla warfare. Their most devastating weapon, however, was fire. They burned whatever lay in the path of the war, including temples, shrines, and aristocratic residences that had long formed the cultural heart of Kyoto. Fires spread across the city so relentlessly that large parts of the capital were reduced to ruins. The Ashigaru did not cause every destruction, but they embodied the most terrifying features of the conflict: mobility, unpredictability, and indifference to older social and religious restraints. The war in Kyoto did not really end so much as dissolve. The succession issue that had sparked it was resolved relatively early, but by then, the conflict had taken on a life of its own. Alliances shifted constantly. Great houses split and recombined, private feuds replaced any common purpose. One by one, the military groups that had crowded the capital drifted away. By 1477, the last major contingents departed, leaving behind a shattered city and no restored order. After that, the central military government retained little more than nominal authority. Its network of provincial supporters had collapsed, and even surviving old military families maintained only weak ties to Kyoto. Across much of the country, power fell into the hands of those able to take and hold it. Social upheaval reached every level. Peasants rose against landlords. Retainers turned on their lords. Inferiors overthrew superiors. The phrase often used for this age captures the violence of that reversal. Those below overthrew those above. From this fractured world, there gradually emerged a new type of regional ruler. Beginning in the late 15th century, strong military leaders carved out domains and ruled them as near independent states. Some descended from the old provincial governors, others rose from relative obscurity. Most came from the ranks of local warrior families, often from among men who had once served under the earlier order. They ruled territories that were generally smaller than those claimed by the older provincial lords, but they ruled them more directly and more effectively. In this new age, inherited status mattered less than military ability. Even a ruler born into office had to prove himself by leading followers successfully in war. Since vassals constantly wanted more land and reward, rulers were pushed toward expansion. New land usually had to be taken from neighbours, which meant that many regional lords fought campaign after campaign beyond their borders. This was not merely reluctant pressure from below. Ambitious commanders themselves were equally eager. In a predatory age, success in war defined political legitimacy. One of the clearest examples of this restless military world can be seen in the rivalry between Takeda Shingen and Uesugi Kenshin, two of the most famous warlords of 16th century Japan. Their repeated clashes in central Japan became legendary, but what matters most is not simply the drama of their encounters. Their story reveals how the politics of the age worked. Both men emerged from a world in which family betrayal, internal coups, and relentless campaigning were normal. Shingen's own rise came through the abrupt overthrow of his father. Kenshin likewise rose through violent family conflict. Such acts were shocking in theory, yet in practice they were common. Military authority had become inseparable from personal strength. Rulers in this age also used marriage as a strategic weapon. Daughters, sisters, and other female relatives were married into rival houses to create temporary alliances. These arrangements produced dense and often bewildering webs of kinship, but they were rarely permanent or secure. Men who became formal allies through marriage might have invaded one another's lands in the past and would do so again in the future. Such pacts were tools, not lasting bonds. They served immediate needs and were abandoned when circumstances changed. The famous campaigns of Shingen and Kenshin show both the intensity and the limits of warfare in this period. The two fought repeated battles over the same contested region, something unusual in an age when warlords more often broke off inconclusive struggles and sought easier opportunities elsewhere. Their rivalry became a symbol of persistent military competition. Yet even these famous encounters did not produce a decisive resolution. One prevented invasion of his home province. The other continued absorbing neighbouring territory. In that sense, both could claim success. But in a larger historical view, their repeated struggle also distracted them, while another warlord farther west began taking the first major steps toward unifying the country. That broader transformation was accelerated by a technological shift. The arrival of firearms from Europe in the mid-16th century. But even before guns reshaped battle, the military methods of the age had already developed certain regular patterns. Campaigns were usually limited in scope. A ruler invaded neighbouring territory to take land, burn resources, or weaken an enemy, not necessarily to destroy an entire state at once. Campaigns were also governed by the agricultural calendar. Since many foot soldiers were peasants, armies could not remain in the field indefinitely without threatening planting and harvest. Troops might simply go home if their fields needed attention. That reality imposed a rhythm on warfare. Some commanders campaigned in autumn and winter to avoid conflict with agricultural work, but even then they had to reckon with terrain and weather. Battles themselves were often brief. Most lasted less than a day, and many warlords preferred skirmishing to all-out confrontation. The reason was practical. Heavy losses were dangerous even in victory. Armies weakened by one bloody battle might become easy prey for other rivals. Campaigns were part of a continuing competitive landscape, not isolated tests of honour. Only a few commanders consistently sought major head-on engagements. Forts, therefore, became central to war. They were everywhere. Tens of thousands were built during the broader pre-modern period, and most belonged to this age of fragmentation. In the early and middle parts of that period, the main strongholds were usually mountain forts. At first, rulers lived below and retreated upward only when attacked. Later, these fortifications were expanded to include residences and more substantial defensive layers spread down the slope. Their features included moats, earthen embankments, wooden palisades, and towers for archers and later, gunners. Alongside their principal strongholds, lords often maintained networks of lesser forts, serving as outposts, garrisons, signal stations, border guards, or obstacles to movement. Sometimes a commander even built an additional fort, simply to serve as a base from which to attack another. These strongholds could appear and disappear with astonishing speed. Victorious commanders destroyed enemy forts in large numbers. New forts were thrown up quickly on captured ground. War in this period was therefore not just a matter of battle between armies in open field. It was a struggle over positions, movement, resources, and local control. Forts anchored authority, extended influence, and gave temporary structure to a world in constant military motion. That was the world into which firearms would soon arrive, and in that already violent and unstable landscape, they would not create war from nothing. They would instead intensify a system that had already been shaped by rebellion, ambition, betrayal, and relentless competition. Fire was one of the most destructive tools used against fortifications. Attackers often attempted to burn forts outright, launching flaming arrows over the defences. Defenders tried to counter this threat by coating wooden structures with wet mud to prevent flames from spreading. Outside the walls, the surrounding countryside was frequently set ablaze. Villages, crops, and farmland were deliberately destroyed. These fires served several purposes. They weakened the defenders economically, destroyed the homes of local soldiers stationed inside the fort, and applied psychological pressure by surrounding the defenders with smoke and devastation. Another constant factor shaping strategy during the Sengoku period was betrayal. Alliances were unstable, loyalties were uncertain, and deception played a major role in warfare. There is a famous story about a war council held by Oda Nobunaga before one of his most important battles. His commanders gathered expecting a strategic discussion. Instead, Nobunaga appeared in ceremonial robes and performed a classical dance. As the officers returned to their quarters, they concluded that their lord had lost his senses. In reality, Nobunaga had suspected that someone present might secretly report his plans to the enemy. By revealing nothing, he protected his strategy. Nobunaga himself frequently relied on persuasion and intrigue. He often attempted to convince enemy officers or vassals to defect. When such betrayals occurred, he acted immediately. Speed was essential. A commander who changed sides might reconsider if given time, and the moment of confusion caused by treachery could offer a brief but decisive advantage. In one typical tactic, Nobunaga would secretly persuade the commander of a smaller supporting fort to betray the main fortress nearby. As soon as the betrayal was secured, he launched an attack before the defenders could reorganize. The widespread use of betrayal reveals how unstable many relationships had become in Sengoku warrior society. Vassals frequently abandoned their lords. Soldiers sometimes deserted their own armies and joined the enemy. Even during the surrender of a fort, soldiers who were allowed to leave freely occasionally enlisted immediately in the victorious army. In some cases, the commander of a besieged fort asked to enter the service of the enemy, rather than die. Nobunaga sometimes accepted such offers, though he demanded proof of loyalty. Hostages were commonly required, often close relatives, such as a mother or sons. Everyone involved understood the consequences. If the new vassal later betrayed him, those hostages would be executed without hesitation. Espionage was also a constant concern. Daimyo governments tried to restrict communication between neighbouring domains to prevent the spread of information. Residents near borders were warned to be particularly cautious about speaking with outsiders. Even family connections created suspicion. Women who married into rival families were sometimes believed to be spies. One domain law even advised warriors who had married politically connected wives to keep their swords within reach at all times, even while sleeping. Japan had encountered gunpowder weapons long before firearms became common. During the Mongol invasions of the 13th century, attackers launched explosive devices using catapults. Later, crude firing tubes from China appeared in Japan. However, true firearms were unknown until the mid-16th century. Everything changed when Portuguese traders arrived unexpectedly on a small southern island after their ship was blown off course during a storm. They carried matchlock arquebuses, early muzzle-loading firearms. The local lord quickly became fascinated by the weapons and ordered craftsmen in his domain to reproduce them. At first, the process was difficult. Japanese metalworkers had to experiment repeatedly before learning how to manufacture reliable firearms. But knowledge spread rapidly. Within only a few years, gunsmiths in the central provinces were producing weapons in growing numbers. By the late 1540s, firearms had already appeared on the battlefield. By the following decade, many major warlords had incorporated gunners into their armies. One notable commander reportedly fielded hundreds of firearms in a single battle. Yet firearms and ammunition remained difficult to supply. Gunpowder required saltpeter, which Japan lacked and had to import from abroad. Despite this limitation, firearm units soon became central elements of many armies. The introduction of guns also changed the structure of armies. Gunners had to operate together in coordinated formations. They required protection while reloading, since the slow process left them vulnerable to attack. As a result, armies developed organized units of spearmen and archers to defend the gunners and maintain pressure on the enemy between volleys. Oda Nobunaga clearly recognized the importance of firearms. Early in his rise to power, he secured control of key commercial centers that produced weapons. By controlling major gun foundries, he ensured a steady supply of firearms for his army. Nobunaga's rise began dramatically in 1560 with a battle that would become legendary. An opposing warlord invaded Nobunaga's territory with a force many times larger than his own. Nobunaga advanced cautiously, pushing aside smaller enemy units and moving toward the main army. As his forces approached, a sudden rainstorm swept across the battlefield. When the downpour ended, Nobunaga launched a surprise attack. The enemy camp had relaxed its vigilance during the storm and was completely unprepared. Nobunaga's troops rushed forward and the enemy army collapsed in confusion. Its commander was killed and the invading force scattered. This victory became famous as an example of how a smaller army could defeat a larger one through bold action. Yet the triumph was also shaped by chance. The sudden storm, combined with poor reconnaissance by the opposing army, created an opportunity that Nobunaga quickly seized. Despite the fame of this surprise attack, Nobunaga did not rely on such tactics again in his major battles. In several later engagements, he adopted strong defensive positions and allowed enemies to exhaust themselves attacking fortified lines. However, in the countless smaller clashes that filled the Sengoku era, his methods were similar to those of other warlords. Fortifications were built, attacked, destroyed, and rebuilt constantly as armies competed for strategic positions. Political maneuvering was just as important as battlefield success. Alliances were formed and broken whenever circumstances changed. Sometimes, commanders violated agreements knowing that hostages or even family members might suffer the consequences. One alliance, however, proved enduring. After the famous battle that launched Nobunaga's rise, a neighboring leader named Tokugawa Ieyasu became his ally. For decades, the two men fought together, sharing both victories and defeats. Nobunaga entered the imperial capital several years later and quickly became the dominant political force in the country. Although the shogun still held formal authority, Nobunaga intended him to remain only a symbolic figure. When the shogun attempted to assert independent power, Nobunaga removed him from office and effectively ended the old shogunate. From that point onward, Nobunaga ruled as the true master of the country, even without holding a formal title. His rise marked the end of the long era of fragmented warfare and the beginning of a new struggle to unify Japan under a single authority. The transition toward national unification also transformed warfare. Firearms were used in ever greater numbers. Castles became massive stone fortresses, surrounded by wide moats and towering defensive walls. Armies grew larger and increasingly professional as warriors separated from the farming population and became permanent soldiers.